Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I've been running patrol along Highway 75 through Iberville Parish for going on 8 years now, and I can tell you, there's something about these back roads that gets into your bones. The air sits heavy here, thick with moisture that never quite lifts even in winter, and the smell of decay from the swamps mixes with mud and wild cypress until you can't tell where the water ends and the land begins. Most nights it's just me, the cruiser, and the low hum of the radio cutting through that oppressive quiet that settles over the bayou after sunset. You learn to read the silences out here, to feel when something's different in the rhythm of the place, and on the night of November 7th, I felt it the moment I started my shift. The fog had rolled in early that evening, thick as cotton and sitting low across the asphalt so my headlights barely cut 15 feet ahead. I'd radioed in to dispatch around 2100 hours, let them know visibility was poor and I'd be running slow along the southern route past Grostate. Darla Moreau was working dispatch that night, her voice crackling through the static with that familiar Cajun lilt that made even routine calls sound like old friends catching up. She acknowledged my position and told me to stay safe out there. Said the weather service was calling for the fog to lift around midnight. But I'd learned long ago not to trust what the weather service says about Louisiana swamps. The fog does what it wants when it wants, and all you can do is wait it out. I'd been driving for maybe 20 minutes when I caught the first flash of taillights ahead. 2 red dots hovering in the mist like cigarette embers in a dark room. Wasn't unusual to see another vehicle out here even this late. Plenty of folks worked night shifts at the chemical plants upriver or were heading home from Baton Rouge. But something about the way those lights moved made me pay attention. They weren't steady, weren't following the gentle curves of the highway the way you'd expect. Instead, they seemed to drift sideways across my field of vision like they were floating rather than driving. I eased off the accelerator and watched as the lights disappeared into a thicker bank of fog, then reappeared 50 yards further down the road in a position that didn't make sense given the time that had passed. I keyed my radio and called it in. LSP 472 to dispatch. I've got a possible erratic driver southbound on 75 near mile marker 42, requesting a plate check when I can get close enough for visual. Darla's voice came back steady and professional, told me to proceed with caution and she'd stand by for the information. I accelerated gently, trying to close the distance without spooking whoever was ahead, and as I got within maybe 30 yards, I could make out the shape of the vehicle itself. It was an older model sedan, something from the early 2000s by the look of it, dark blue or black though it was hard to tell in the fog and the wash of my headlights. The license plate was visible enough and I called it out to Darla, reading off the numbers and letters while keeping my eyes on those taillights that continued their strange drifting motion. There was a longer pause than usual before Darla came back on, and I could hear something different in her voice, something uncertain. LSP 472, I'm showing that plate registered to a 2004 Honda Accord. Blue, but Claiborne, there's a flag on it. I asked her what kind of flag, already knowing I wasn't going to like the answer. Vehicle was reported lost in the flooding back in 2018 during Hurricane Selene. Last known location was near Port Allen before the waters came up. Vehicle was never recovered, presumed destroyed or buried in the swamp mud. I felt that cold finger of unease trace down my spine, the kind you can't shake off no matter how many logical explanations you try to stack up against it. I told Darla I was going to attempt a traffic stop, hit my lights and siren to see if the driver would pull over. The blue and red lights painted the fog in carnival colors, and the siren cut through the heavy air with an urgency that felt almost obscene in all that silence. But the sedan ahead didn't slow down, didn't pull to the shoulder, didn't react at all to my presence behind it. It just kept moving at that same steady pace, maybe 40 miles per hour, drifting slightly across the center line and then back again, like the driver wasn't quite paying attention, or maybe like there was no driver at all. I called it in again, told Darla the vehicle was failing to yield and I was going to pursue, and she acknowledged with instructions to maintain safe distance given the weather conditions. For the next 10 minutes, I followed that sedan through the fog, my speedometer holding steady at 45, while those taillights stayed exactly the same distance ahead, no matter whether I accelerated or slowed down. It was like chasing a ghost, like the vehicle existed in some pocket of space that kept it perpetually out of reach, and the rational part of my mind was screaming at me that this was just fog playing tricks with perspective, just poor visibility making distances hard to judge. But 8 years of driving these roads had taught me to trust my instincts, and my instincts were telling me something was fundamentally wrong with what I was seeing. Then the radio started acting up. The static that's always present out here in the swamp suddenly got worse, building to a roar that made me wince and reach for the volume. But underneath the static I could hear something else, something that made the hair on my arm stand straight up. It was a voice, distant and distorted, repeating the same phrase over and over. "Turn back. Water's rising. Turn back." I grabbed the handset and tried to raise Darla, but got nothing except that voice cutting in and out of the white noise, always the same words, in the same rhythm, like a recording stuck on loop. "Turn back. Water's rising. Turn back." I was about to pull over, about to stop this whole damn chase and figure out what was going on with my equipment, when the sedan ahead suddenly veered hard to the right and disappeared down a side road I hadn't even known was there. I hit my brakes and nearly slid past the turnoff, caught a glimpse of a rusted road sign that read, "Old River Road, no outlet," before the fog swallowed it again. Every bit of training I had was telling me not to follow, not to pursue an unidentified vehicle down an unfamiliar road in zero visibility. But something else was driving me now, some need to understand what I was seeing. I turned the wheel and followed those taillights into the dark. Old River Road was barely a road at all, more like a suggestion of asphalt with weeds growing up through the cracks and water pooling in the low spots where the bayou was trying to reclaim what had once been cleared. My cruiser bounced over ruts and potholes while the fog pressed in so close I could barely see the hood ornament, and those taillights ahead kept moving with that same impossible steadiness, never getting closer or further away. The radio had gone completely silent now, not even static, just a dead emptiness that was somehow worse than the voices had been. I tried the handset 3 times but got nothing, like I was completely cut off from the rest of the world. The trees closed in on both sides of the road, ancient cypress and tupelo with their roots disappearing into standing water that reflected my headlights like broken mirrors. Spanish moss hung so low in places I could hear it brushing against the roof of the cruiser, a sound like fingers dragging across metal. And the smell through the vents was overwhelming now, that rich rot of organic matter breaking down in warm water mixed with something else I couldn't quite identify. It reminded me of how the air smells after a funeral, when they've opened the earth and disturbed soil that hasn't seen sunlight in years. I don't know how long I followed that sedan. Could have been 5 minutes or 50. Time seemed to stretch and compress in weird ways as the road kept winding deeper into the swamp. I passed a few structures along the way, old fishing camps and hunting shacks that looked abandoned for decades, their roofs caved in and their walls rotting back into the earth. One had a boat still tied to a listing pier, half submerged and green with algae, and I found myself wondering who had left it there and whether they'd ever come back for it. The taillights ahead flickered once, twice, then brightened again, and I had the strangest sensation that the vehicle was aware of me, that it knew I was following and was leading me somewhere specific. That's when I noticed the water. It had been creeping across the road in patches, just shallow overflow from the swamp, but now it was getting deeper, covering the asphalt in a continuous sheet that threw up spray from my tires. I slowed down, worried about flooding, and checked my mirrors to judge how far I'd come and whether I'd be able to turn around. But the fog behind me was total now, a solid wall of gray that made it look like the road simply didn't exist anymore, like I'd driven off the edge of the world into some liminal space where the normal rules didn't apply. The sedan's brake lights flared sudden and bright, and I instinctively hit my own brakes, felt the cruiser slide slightly on the wet pavement before the tires caught. The vehicle ahead had stopped in the middle of the road, just sitting there with its engine running, and for the first time I could see it clearly through the fog. It was definitely a Honda Accord, dark blue, with a layer of mud coating the lower panels and something dark streaking down from the door handles like rust or dried blood. The license plate matched what I'd called in, and I sat there with my hands on the wheel trying to decide what to do next. Standard procedure would be to approach the vehicle, make contact with the driver, but every instinct I had was screaming at me to put the cruiser in reverse and get the hell out of there. I compromised by calling it in again, grabbed the handset and tried to raise dispatch. LSP 472 to dispatch. I've got the vehicle stopped on Old River Road off Highway 75, requesting backup for a traffic stop. Nothing but silence answered me. That same dead air that felt like the radio wasn't even powered on. I checked the unit and it showed active, showed full power and signal strength. But when I keyed the mic again, I got nothing. Not even my own voice echoing back at me. I sat there in the cruiser for what felt like a full minute, watching the sedan idle in my headlights, watching the fog swirl around it in patterns that didn't match the wind. Then the driver's door opened. I tensed, hand moving automatically to my sidearm, but nobody got out. The door just swung wide and stayed there, showing a dark interior that my headlights couldn't quite penetrate. I waited for movement, for some indication of who or what was inside that vehicle, but saw nothing. The door hung open like an invitation or a warning, and the fog began to drift inside the cabin, filling it with gray until I couldn't tell if there was anyone in there or not. That's when my radio came back to life. The static returned first, building slow like someone was turning up the volume, and then that voice broke through again, clearer now but still distorted, still wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Water's rising. Turn back. Water's rising. But this time there was something else underneath it. Another sound that might have been breathing or might have been the wind moving through hollow spaces, and as I listened I realized the voice wasn't coming from my radio at all. It was coming from outside, from somewhere in the fog around me. A woman's voice calling out words that made my chest tight with an anxiety I couldn't name. I grabbed my flashlight and my sidearm, made the decision to approach the vehicle, made it against every bit of judgment and experience that told me this was wrong. I opened my door and stepped out into the fog, felt the water immediately seep into my boots as I planted my feet on the flooded road. The temperature had dropped. I could see my breath now mixing with the mist, and the silence was complete except for that distant voice that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere. Water's rising. Turn back. I moved forward slowly, flashlight cutting a cone of light through the gray, and approached the open driver's door of the sedan. The interior was empty. No driver, no passenger, nothing but wet seats and a dashboard covered in mud, and what looked like water stains that had dried into strange patterns. The keys were still in the ignition, the engine still running with a rough idle that suggested it had been underwater at some point and never quite recovered. I reached in and turned it off, pulled the keys and dropped them in my pocket, and that's when I noticed the smell. It was the same smell I'd been catching through my vents, but stronger now, concentrated. The smell of standing water and rot, and something chemical underneath it all like formaldehyde or embalming fluid. I backed away from the sedan and swept my flashlight across the surrounding area, looking for footprints or signs of where the driver might have gone. But the water covering the road was undisturbed, smooth as glass, and the fog pressed in so close I could barely see 10 feet in any direction. Then, my light caught something off to the left, a shape that resolved into a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, barely visible through the mist. My hand went to my weapon, and I called out, "Louisiana State Police, show me your hands." But the figure didn't move, didn't respond, just stood there motionless as the fog drifted around it. I took a step closer, flashlight beam steady on the figure, and as I got nearer, I could see it was a woman, or had been a woman at some point. She wore what looked like an old sundress, soaked through and clinging to a frame so thin I could see the outline of her ribs, and her hair hung in wet ropes around a face that was too pale, too still, skin with that same bluish tint I'd seen on drowning victims. Her eyes were open but unfocused, staring at something I couldn't see, and her lips were moving slightly as if she was speaking, but no sound was coming out except that voice that still echoed from everywhere. "Water's rising. Turn back." I froze, my hand tight on my weapon but not drawing it, not yet, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, trying to fit it into some framework that made rational sense. Maybe she was injured. Maybe she'd been in the sedan and wandered off in shock. Maybe she needed help. I called out to her again, asked if she was all right, asked if she needed medical assistance, and this time her eyes shifted to focus on me. There was no recognition in them, no awareness, just a terrible empty quality, like looking into standing water that goes down forever with nothing living in it. Then she smiled, and that smile was the worst thing I'd ever seen. It wasn't malicious or threatening, wasn't even really directed at me. It was just the automatic movement of muscles in a face that had forgotten how to be human. She raised one hand slowly, pointing past me back toward where my cruiser sat with its light still cutting through the fog, and when she spoke her voice didn't match the movement of her lips, came from somewhere else in the swamp. "Turn back before the water takes you too." That broke whatever spell had been holding me in place. I backed up fast, flashlight beam jerking across the fog, and when I looked for her again, she was gone. Just empty space where she'd been standing, and the fog closing in to fill the absence. I ran back to my cruiser, splashing through the rising water, and I don't care how that sounds or what it says about my courage because in that moment, all I wanted was to be away from that place, away from that empty sedan and that drowned woman and the voice that kept calling from the fog. I made it back to Highway 75 somehow, though I couldn't tell you exactly how I navigated those turns or found my way through the fog that should have made the route impossible. The cruiser's engine roared as I pushed the accelerator hard, watching my mirrors more than the road ahead, expecting to see those taillights reappear at any moment or worse, expecting to see that figure standing in the middle of the road, forcing me to stop. But there was nothing behind me except the fog slowly thinning as I put distance between myself and Old River Road. Nothing except the radio gradually coming back to life with bursts of static and voices that sounded almost normal. Darla's voice cut through clear and concerned, asking for my status, asking why I'd gone dark for nearly 40 minutes. I grabbed the handset with a shaking hand and told her I was clear, told her I'd lost radio contact while pursuing the vehicle but had broken off the chase and was returning to patrol. She asked if I'd made contact with the driver and I hesitated, trying to figure out how to explain what I'd seen in a way that wouldn't sound insane, before settling for a simple, negative vehicle was abandoned. That seemed to satisfy her, and she logged the incident and told me to return to the station for an equipment check since my radio had been malfunctioning. I drove straight past the station. I didn't trust what I might say if I had to sit down and write up an official report right then. Didn't trust that I wouldn't sound like I'd lost my mind or been drinking on duty. Instead, I drove the familiar routes through Gross Estate and White Castle, drove past the late-night gas stations and truck stops where I'd stopped 1,000 times before, soaking in the normal and ordinary until my hands stopped shaking and my breathing evened out. The fog had lifted by the time I reached Plaquemine, revealing a clear night with stars visible between the clouds, and I finally started to believe I'd actually left that place behind. I finished out my shift on routine patrol, made a couple of traffic stops for speeding, and helped a stranded motorist with a dead battery. And by the time I clocked out at 0600 hours, I'd almost convinced myself that what I'd seen had been some combination of fog and fatigue playing tricks on my perception. Almost convinced myself, but not quite, because I still had those keys from the sedan in my pocket, still had that smell of standing water and decay clinging to my uniform. I went home and showered for 30 minutes, scrubbing until my skin was raw, then sat at my kitchen table with a beer I didn't drink and watched the sunrise through the window while trying not to think about empty eyes and voices calling from the swamp. I slept badly those next few days, kept waking up with the sensation of being underwater, of pressure building in my chest and lungs while I sank into dark water that had no bottom. When I was awake, I kept seeing that figure at the edge of the tree line, kept hearing that voice telling me to turn back, and I found myself checking my rearview mirror more than I needed to, even in broad daylight on busy streets. Malcolm Roussel, a sheriff's deputy I'd known for years, noticed I was off during a joint patrol and asked if everything was okay. I told him I was just tired, just needed a few good nights of sleep, and he accepted that with the easy camaraderie of someone who'd been through his own rough patches and knew better than to push. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me back from Old River Road, some presence that had attached itself to me when I'd stepped into that fog and approached that abandoned sedan. It was nothing I could point to, nothing concrete, just a sense of being watched that persisted even when I was alone in my apartment with all the doors locked and lights on. I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision that vanished when I turned to look directly at it, would hear footsteps on the floor above me, even though I lived on the top floor, would wake up some mornings to find puddles of water on my bathroom floor that hadn't been there when I went to bed. 3 nights after the incident, I was back on patrol, working the same route through Iberville Parish, and dispatch sent me to check on a disabled vehicle near mile marker 42. My stomach dropped when I heard the location, but I acknowledged the call and drove toward it with my hands tight on the wheel and my eyes scanning the roadside. The fog was back that night. Not as thick as before, but enough to reduce visibility and make the familiar landscape look strange and threatening. I found the vehicle pulled onto the shoulder, hazards blinking, and as I approached with my spotlight, I felt relief flood through me when I saw it was just a white pickup truck with an elderly man waving for help. I helped him change his tire, made small talk about the weather and the condition of the roads, and tried to ignore the way the fog seemed to be creeping closer as we worked. He thanked me when we were done, told me I was a credit to the uniform, and drove off, leaving me standing there in the dark with my flashlight cutting through the mist. That's when I noticed the side road across the highway, the same turnoff I'd taken 3 nights before, and saw the rusted sign that read, Old River Road, no outlet, just barely visible in the spill of my spotlight. I knew I shouldn't go back, knew that whatever I'd encountered down that road wasn't something I wanted to face again, but I also knew I'd never have peace until I did. I called it in to Darla, told her I was doing a secondary check of the area and might be out of radio contact, and she acknowledged with a reminder to maintain safety protocols. Then I turned my cruiser onto Old River Road and drove into the fog, watching for those taillights that I was half expecting to see materialize ahead of me. The road looked different in some ways, looked the same in others, the cypress trees still pressing in close and the water still covering the asphalt in patches. I drove slowly, scanning both sides for landmarks I might recognize, and after maybe 10 minutes I found the spot where I'd stopped before. Or thought I'd found it. Hard to be certain when everything looked the same, but there were tire tracks in the mud off to the shoulder that matched my cruiser's wheelbase, and something about the configuration of the trees felt familiar in an uncomfortable way. I got out and swept my flashlight across the area, looking for the sedan that had been there before, looking for any sign of that figure I'd seen at the tree line. But there was nothing, just empty road and swamp and fog, just the normal sounds of Louisiana bayou at night with frogs calling and insects buzzing and water moving through the cypress knees. I stood there for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, waiting for something to happen, waiting for that voice to call out from the mist, but the only voice I heard was my own breathing and the crunch of gravel under my boots when I shifted my weight. I was about to leave, about to accept that whatever had happened 3 nights ago was finished, and I was free when my flashlight beam caught something at the water's edge. It was a piece of fabric, dark blue and mud-stained, caught on a branch and moving slightly in the current. I walked over and pulled it free, recognized it immediately as part of a sundress, the same dress I'd seen on that figure in the fog. The fabric was cold and wet and felt wrong in my hands, felt like it had been underwater for a very long time, and when I brought it close to my face, the smell of standing water and decay made my stomach turn. I dropped the fabric and backed away, my flashlight beam jerking across the trees, and that's when I heard it. That voice, distant and distorted, coming from somewhere deeper in the swamp. Water's rising. Turn back. Water's rising. It was fainter now, almost lost in the ambient sound of the bayou, but unmistakable. And I realized with a cold certainty that this wasn't over, that whatever had happened on Old River Road was still happening, would keep happening to anyone who was unlucky enough to follow those taillights into the fog. I made a decision that night standing at the edge of that swamp, made it quickly before I could second-guess myself into paralysis. I got back in my cruiser and drove to the nearest Louisiana Wildlife and Fisheries office, caught Malcolm Roussel just as he was starting his own patrol and asked if he had time to help me with something. He took one look at my face and agreed without asking questions. Followed my cruiser back to Old River Road and parked behind me when I stopped at the entrance to that flooded track. I told him everything then, told him about the sedan with the impossible license plate and the figure at the tree line, and the voice calling from the fog. I expected him to laugh or to suggest I take some time off, but instead he just listened with that careful attention cops develop when they're hearing something that doesn't fit the normal pattern, but can't be dismissed out of hand. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking at the fog drifting across the road before he finally spoke. "My grandfather used to trap out here in the 30s, he said slowly, his accent thicker than usual. Used to tell stories about the roads that got covered when they built the levees and dammed up the old river channels, about whole communities that got swallowed by the swamp when the water rose. Said sometimes the fog would get heavy and you'd see things that shouldn't be there anymore, things that were trying to find their way back to dry land." He looked at me then, his expression serious. Said if you followed them, you'd end up where they ended up, down in the dark water, where the cypress roots go deep and the catfish get big as cars. I asked him if he believed those stories, and he shrugged, a gesture that could have meant anything. "I believe there's things out here we don't understand, things that don't follow the rules we've got written down in our procedures manuals. I believe you saw something real, even if I can't explain what it was." He paused, then added, "And I believe we shouldn't go down that road again. Not tonight. maybe not ever. We sat there in our cruisers for another few minutes, engines idling, watching the fog drift across Old River Road before we finally turned around and drove back to the highway. Malcolm went his way and I went mine, and we never spoke about it again in any official capacity. But sometimes when we crossed paths on patrol, he'd ask how I was doing in a way that suggested he was asking about more than just the usual stress of the job. And I'd tell him I was fine, which wasn't exactly true, but was close enough. The incidents continued, though less frequently as time went on. I'd be driving patrol and catch those taillights in the fog, would feel that pull to follow them, but I learned to resist, learned to call it in and let dispatch handle it, learned to turn away before I got close enough to see the license plate. Other troopers reported similar sightings, vehicles that matched descriptions of cars lost in hurricanes or floods, vehicles that seemed to appear and disappear without any logical pattern, but nobody wanted to be the one to file an official report that suggested we were chasing ghosts through the bayou. I keep the keys from that sedan in my desk drawer at home. Keep them as a reminder of the night I followed something I shouldn't have followed and came back different than when I left. Sometimes, late at night, when I can't sleep, I take them out and look at them, the metal tarnished and pitted with corrosion, and I wonder about the person who owned that car, wonder if they knew they were driving towards something they couldn't escape, wonder if they're still out there in the fog trying to warn people away from the same mistake. The water's still rising in Iberville Parish, has been for years as climate change and subsidence slowly reclaim the land we thought we'd tamed. More roads flood every season, more houses get abandoned to the swamp, more pieces of the modern world sink back into the dark water and mud. And sometimes, when the fog is thick and I'm driving patrol through the back roads at night, I hear that voice calling from somewhere in the gray, always the same words, always the same desperate warning. Water's rising. Turn back. I don't go down Old River Road anymore. I've marked it on my mental map as a place to avoid, same as you'd mark a spot where the pavement is gone or a bridge is washed out, and I've quietly steered other troopers away from it when I can. But the road is still there, still waiting in the fog for someone who doesn't know better, or who doesn't believe in warnings, still holding whatever it is that wants to be found. And the sedan is still out there too, I'm certain of it, still driving through the mist with its impossible license plate and its empty interior, still leading people toward the water that's always rising. Last week, Darla radioed me with another report of an erratic driver on Highway 75 near mile marker 42, asked if I could check it out. I acknowledged the call and drove toward the location. And when I got close enough to see the taillights ahead of me, drifting through the fog in that familiar wrong way, I made a choice. I hit my brakes and sat there on the shoulder, watching those lights fade into the mist, watching them move toward the turnoff for Old River Road. Then I keyed my radio and told Darla I'd lost visual contact, that the vehicle had vanished before I could get close enough for a plate check. She asked if I wanted backup to search the area, and I told her negative. Told her the fog was too thick and we'd be better off waiting for it to clear. She accepted that and cleared me for regular patrol, and I sat there for another 5 minutes watching that side road, watching the fog swirl around the rusted sign that said no outlet, before I finally put the cruiser in gear and drove away. Because I know now what Malcolm knew all along, what his grandfather probably learned the hard way back in the 30s, that some roads don't lead anywhere we want to go, and some warnings come from people who paid the price for not listening. The bayou keeps its secrets, and the water keeps rising, and somewhere out there in the fog, a blue sedan is still driving roads that don't exist anymore, carrying a message that most people won't understand until it's too late. I understood it, learned it in the worst way possible, and now I carry it with me every time I start my shift and drive out into the dark. Turn back before the water takes you too. Turn back while you still can. Turn back because the people who went ahead aren't coming back, and they don't want you to follow them into the places they've gone. That's my story, or as much of it as I can tell without sounding like I've lost my grip on reality. Make of it what you will, believe it or don't. But if you ever find yourself driving through Louisiana bayou country on a foggy night, and you see taillights ahead that move just a little bit wrong, do yourself a favor and turn around. Don't follow them down side roads with rusted signs. Don't stop when they stop. And whatever you do, don't approach the vehicle when the driver's door swings open and nobody gets out. Just turn back before the water rises too high and you can't find your way to dry land anymore. I still patrol Highway 75 through Iberville Parish. Still drive past mile marker 42 almost every shift, and I still see that turnoff for Old River Road disappearing into the fog. But I don't go down it. Won't ever go down it again, no matter what I see or hear or feel pulling me toward it. Because I've learned that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, some questions aren't meant to be answered, and some warnings need to be heeded even when you don't fully understand what you're being warned about. The radio crackles sometimes with that voice, usually on the foggiest nights when visibility drops to almost nothing and the swamp presses in close on all sides. Water's rising, turn back, and I do turn back every single time because I know what waits at the end of Old River Road, what's been waiting there since the floods came and covered over the places people used to live. It's waiting still. Will always be waiting, patient as the swamp itself, ready for the next person who doesn't believe in warnings or who thinks they can solve a mystery that's been claiming lives for decades. My shift ends at dawn, same as always, when the fog burns off and the world goes back to pretending it makes sense. I clock out and go home and try to sleep without dreaming of standing water and empty cars and figures at the tree line with eyes that look through you instead of at you. Most days I succeed. Some days I don't. But I'm still here, still breathing, still walking around on dry land instead of sinking into the mud at the bottom of some forgotten bayou channel. And that's more than I can say for whoever was driving that blue sedan before the water rose and took them down into the dark where the cypress roots grow and the things that shouldn't exist anymore wait for company. Turn back. That's the only advice I've got. The only wisdom I can pass along from 8 years of patrolling these swamp roads and seeing things that don't fit in any report I could file. Turn back while you still can, before you follow something into the fog that leads you somewhere you can't return from. Turn back because the water's rising and it's been rising for a long time, and once it gets high enough there's no dry ground left to stand on. I wish I'd turned back sooner. I wish I'd listened to the warning instead of having to learn it firsthand. But at least I learned it, at least I'm still here to tell the story, and maybe that's the point. Maybe some of us have to go into the dark so we can come back and warn others away. Maybe that's the price we pay for wearing the uniform and patrolling the places where the normal world blurs into something stranger and more dangerous. The keys are still in my desk drawer. The voice still calls from the fog. Old River Road still waits for someone who doesn't know better. And I still drive past it every night, watching that turnoff disappear into the mist, remembering what I saw and what I heard and what I barely escaped. Remembering and warning anyone who'll listen. Turn back before the water takes you too. There's a stretch of Highway 31 that runs along Bayou Teche, where the old live oaks grow so thick their branches meet overhead and create a tunnel of shadows even in full daylight. And at night, that tunnel becomes something else entirely. Becomes a passage through darkness so complete, you feel like you're driving through the throat of something vast and patient. I've worked that route for the better part of 6 years. Know every curve and dip of the asphalt. Know which spots flood first when the rains come, and where the deer like to cross at dusk. but I've never gotten comfortable with those 3 miles between Parks and Bro Bridge, where the trees close in and the water on both sides reflects the stars like broken glass. It was just past midnight on a Thursday in late October when I made the stop that changed how I see that road. Changed how I see a lot of things, if I'm being honest about it. The air had that peculiar heaviness it gets in fall when summer hasn't quite given up, but autumn is pressing in anyway, thick with moisture and the smell of decaying vegetation from the bayou, and the moon was nearly full, bright enough that I'd turned off my spotlight and was running with just my headlights and the ambient glow from the sky. Sonny Bro was supposed to be partnered with me that night, but he'd called in sick at the last minute. Said he'd been throwing up all afternoon and wouldn't be fit for duty. So I was working solo patrol, which didn't bother me much as I'd done it hundreds of times before. Dispatch had been quiet for most of the shift. Just the usual late-night radio traffic from the parish deputies and a few calls about suspicious persons or noise complaints that didn't amount to much. And I'd spent the evening running speed enforcement on the main highway before deciding to loop through the back roads and check on some of the fishing camps and hunting properties where we'd been having trouble with theft. The route took me past St. Martinville and south along the bayou, and I was maybe 10 minutes from turning back toward town when I caught the vehicle in my headlights. A gray sedan traveling maybe 30 in a 45 zone, and weaving slightly between the center line and the fog line, like the driver was either drunk or distracted. I hit my blues and pulled in behind it, called the plate into dispatch and waited for the registration to come back while following at a safe distance. The sedan took its time pulling over, drifted onto the shoulder gradually rather than braking hard like most people do when they see law enforcement behind them, and something about that slow response made me pay closer attention, made me run through the mental checklist of what I might be dealing with. Could be impairment, could be mechanical problems, could be someone with warrants who was deciding whether to run or comply. You learn to read these situations from experience and instinct more than any training manual can teach you. Dispatch came back with the registration. A 2019 Toyota Camry registered to an address in Lafayette. No wants or warrants on the vehicle. And I acknowledged as I pulled up behind it on the shoulder with my spotlight trained on the driver's side mirror. Standard procedure. I called out my location and plate number, let them know I was making a traffic stop, and then I sat there for 30 seconds watching the vehicle and the surrounding area before I got out. The driver's window was already down, which was unusual. Most people wait for you to approach before they lower it, and I could see a figure sitting behind the wheel but couldn't make out details from this distance or in this light. I approached on the driver's side with my flashlight in my left hand and my right hand free near my weapon, not because I felt threatened necessarily, but because it's what you do every single time, no matter how routine the stop seems. The light from my flashlight cut through the darkness and illuminated the interior of the sedan, showed me a man, maybe 40 years old, with thinning hair and a button-down shirt that looked like he'd been wearing it all day, his hands on the wheel at 10 and 2 exactly where they should be. Nothing about him immediately suggested impairment or aggression, but when I got close enough to see his face, I noticed his eyes, noticed how wide they were, and how he wasn't quite looking at me but rather at something to his right in the passenger seat. "Evening, sir," I said, keeping my tone professional and neutral. "License and registration, please, and can you tell me why you were weaving back there?" He turned to look at me then, and I saw his jaw working like he was chewing on something or trying to find words. And when he spoke, his voice had a tremor in it that made the hair on my neck stand up. "I'm sorry, officer. I didn't realize I was weaving. We've been having a conversation, and I guess I wasn't paying attention to the road." He reached for his wallet slowly, hands shaking enough that I noticed, and while he fumbled with his license, I shined my flashlight across the passenger seat. It was empty. Just an empty seat with a seatbelt fastened across it like someone had been sitting there and gotten out. but there was no one in the vehicle except the driver. I swept the flashlight across the back seat and the floor, checked the usual places people try to hide things or where passengers might be ducking down, but saw nothing except fast food wrappers and a gym bag. Nothing that explained why this man had said "we," or why he was acting like someone was sitting next to him. I took his license and registration and told him to sit tight while I ran his information, walked back to my cruiser with my flashlight still cutting across the darkness, and that uneasy feeling starting to build in my chest. The license came back clean, no warrants, no suspensions, just a regular middle-aged guy named Marcus Fontenot from Lafayette with no criminal history and no red flags. But when I looked up from my computer screen and trained my spotlight back on the sedan, I saw the driver's head was turned toward the passenger seat again, saw his lips moving like he was talking to someone, saw his hands gesturing in that universal way people communicate when they're having an animated conversation. I watched this for maybe 30 seconds before I got back out and approached the vehicle again, this time more alert, this time with my hand closer to my weapon because something was very wrong here, even if I couldn't articulate exactly what. "Mr. Fontenot," I said when I reached his window, "is there someone else in the vehicle with you?" He looked at me with those wide eyes, and for just a moment I thought I saw relief flash across his face, like he'd been waiting for me to ask that question, like he wanted me to confirm something he'd been too afraid to acknowledge. "You can see him too?" he whispered, and the way he said it made my stomach drop. "You can see him sitting right there?" I looked at the passenger seat again, looked hard, saw nothing but vinyl and that fastened seatbelt, and when I told him there was no one there, his face crumpled like I'd delivered the worst possible news. "He's been there since Parks," Fontenot said, his voice getting higher and thinner. "I stopped at the convenience store, and when I got back in the car, he was just sitting there, didn't say anything at first, just sat there looking at me, and I thought maybe he needed a ride, or maybe he was homeless or something. So I asked him where he was going, and he said he was going where I was going, said he'd been waiting for me." The words were tumbling out now, falling over each other in that way people talk when they've been holding something in for too long and finally have someone to tell. I tried to tell him to get out, tried to pull over and make him leave, but every time I reached for the door handle, he'd look at me and I'd forget what I was doing. And he keeps talking, but I can't understand most of what he's saying. It's like listening to someone speak underwater. I stepped back from the vehicle and pulled out my radio, keyed the mic and called for backup. Told dispatch I had a possible mental health crisis and requested a supervisor and EMS to my location. While I waited for the response, I walked around to the passenger side of the sedan and opened the door, shined my flashlight across the seat and the floor, ran my hand across the vinyl to feel if there was any warmth or impression that would suggest someone had been sitting there recently. Nothing, just cold upholstery, and that faint smell of artificial pine from the air freshener hanging on the rearview mirror. But when I looked back at Fontenot through the windshield, I saw his eyes were locked on something. Saw him press back against his door like he was trying to get as far away as possible from the passenger seat, and he was making this sound in his throat, this whimpering that reminded me of a dog that's been kicked. Dispatch confirmed that backup was en route, ETA 15 minutes, and I acknowledged before walking back to Fontenot's window. "Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle for me, nice and slow. Keep your hands where I can see them." He nodded jerkily and reached for his door handle, got it open and started to swing his legs out, and that's when he stopped, froze with one foot on the ground and his eyes fixed on something behind me. "He's getting out too," Fontenot whispered. "He's following me out." I spun around with my hand on my weapon, flashlight sweeping the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the empty road and the tunnel of trees and the bayou water reflecting moonlight in the distance. "There's no one there," I told him firmly. trying to keep my own voice steady, even though something about this situation was making every instinct I had scream that we needed to move, needed to get away from this spot. "You're experiencing some kind of episode, Mr. Fontenot, and we're going to get you help. But I need you to come with me back to my cruiser and sit in the back seat while we wait for EMS." He shook his head violently, both feet on the ground now, but not moving any further from his vehicle. "If I go with you, he'll follow me. He told me he'll follow me wherever I go now. Said I let him in, and now he can't leave until—" He trailed off, his face going slack. And then he smiled, this terrible, empty smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Until I take him where he needs to go." That's when my thermal camera triggered. I'd forgotten it was running, forgot I'd activated it at the start of my shift because we'd been having issues with people spotlighting deer at night, and the thermal could pick up the heat signatures from vehicles running with their lights off. The camera was mounted on my light bar and fed to a screen in my cruiser. Showed the world in shades of red and orange and yellow based on heat signatures, and when the alarm chirped to indicate it had detected something unusual, I looked back at my vehicle and saw what had triggered it. On the screen, clear as day, there was a second heat signature in the sedan, a human-shaped pattern of warmth sitting in the passenger seat right where Fontenot kept insisting someone was. I stared at that screen for a long moment, tried to process what I was seeing, tried to come up with a rational explanation for a heat signature in an empty seat. Could be a malfunction, could be residual heat from the sun or from the vehicle's heating system, could be a glitch in the camera's processing that was creating a false positive. But the longer I watched it, the clearer it became that this wasn't a random heat pattern. This was the distinct outline of a human figure, complete with a head and shoulders and arms, and it was sitting perfectly still while Fontenot's heat signature next to it flickered and moved with his obvious agitation. I keyed my radio again, asked dispatch to expedite that backup and to have them bring the supervisor's thermal equipment, and I could hear the confusion in the dispatcher's voice when she asked why I needed additional thermal imaging. I told her I'd explain when they arrived and signed off, then walked back to where Fontenot was still standing next to his open door, still pressed up against the sedan like he was afraid to move away from it. "Mr. Fontenot, I need you to stay calm, and I need you to do exactly what I say. We're going to walk together to my cruiser, and I'm going to put you in the back seat, and we're going to wait there for help to arrive. Can you do that for me?" He looked at me, and then looked at the passenger seat, looked at the empty space that apparently wasn't empty for him, and I saw his whole body start to tremble. "He says he won't let me go," Fontenot said softly. "He says I invited him in when I asked him where he was going. Says that was permission, and now he gets to stay until he's finished with what he needs to do." I asked him what the passenger needed to do, and Fontenot's smile got wider, got more wrong, until it looked like something was pulling his face into that expression against his will. "He needs to get home," he said in a voice that didn't sound quite like his own anymore, a voice that had a wet quality to it, like someone speaking with a mouthful of bayou water. He's been away from home for so long, walking these roads trying to find a ride, and I was the first person to stop and offer help. He just wants to go home. The backup arrived finally, came screaming down Highway 31 with lights and sirens that cut through the quiet of the bayou night, and I'd never been so relieved to see another cruiser in my life. It was Sergeant Boyd from Parks Station, along with a deputy I didn't recognize, and they pulled up behind my vehicle and got out with that purposeful stride that supervisors develop, ready to assess and take control of whatever situation I'd called them into. I met them between the vehicles and gave them the abbreviated version, told them about Fontenot's behavior and his insistence that someone was in the passenger seat, and I showed them the thermal camera feed on my screen. Boyd studied the image for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the darkness, and then he walked to his cruiser and pulled out his own thermal equipment, a handheld unit that was newer and supposedly more accurate than my mounted camera. He aimed it at the sedan, and we all watched the display as it registered the heat signature of Fontenot still standing by the driver's door, and then registered that second signature in the passenger seat, that human-shaped pattern of warmth that shouldn't exist. Boyd lowered the camera and looked at me, and I could see him running through the same mental calculations I'd been running, trying to find an explanation that didn't require him to believe in something impossible. "Could be equipment malfunction," he said finally, but he didn't sound convinced. "Both cameras having the same glitch at the same time?" I asked, and he shook his head slowly. "Not likely, but I've seen stranger things." He called out to Fontenot, told him to move away from the vehicle and come toward us, and I watched Fontenot's face as he processed the command. He took one step forward, then another, moving like someone wading through deep water, and with each step he took I saw his expression change, saw some of the tension leave his body, like he was finally getting distance from whatever had been pressing in on him. He made it maybe 5 feet before he stopped so abruptly it was like he'd hit an invisible wall, and his face went from relieved to terrified in the space of a heartbeat. "He's coming with me," Fontenot said, his voice rising to a shout. "He's right behind me. He's touching my shoulder. And then he was running, broke into a dead sprint toward the tree line, away from all of us, away from the vehicles, away from the road, just running into the darkness like something was chasing him. Boyd and the deputy took off after him while I stayed with the vehicles, kept my flashlight trained on the tree line where they'd disappeared, and tried to ignore the fact that on my thermal camera screen there were now 3 heat signatures moving through the woods instead of the 2 I should have been seeing. They found Fontenot maybe 10 minutes later, found him crouched in a stand of palmetto about 50 yards from the road, his arms wrapped around his knees, and his eyes locked on some point in the middle distance that none of them could identify. Boyd radioed that they had him, that he wasn't injured but wasn't responsive either, and asked me to bring a blanket from my trunk because Fontenot was shivering despite the warm night. I grabbed the emergency blanket and made my way into the woods, following the beams of their flashlights until I found them in a small clearing where the moonlight filtered through the canopy and painted everything in silver and shadow. Fontenot didn't react when I draped the blanket over his shoulders, didn't acknowledge any of us standing around him, just kept staring at that invisible point and rocking slowly back and forth. The deputy, whose name tag read Broussard, was checking him for injuries and asking standard medical questions that weren't getting any response, while Boyd stood a few feet away scanning the woods with his thermal camera. "You getting anything?" I asked him, quietly, and he shook his head without looking away from the display. "Just the 4 of us. Nothing else moving out here except maybe an opossum about 30 yards north. But I'd seen that 3rd signature on my camera, seen it clear as day following Fontenot into the trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still here somewhere, still watching us from just beyond the range of our lights and equipment." EMS arrived while we were still in the woods, and we helped Fontenot back to the road where they could assess him properly. The paramedics did their evaluation, checked his vitals and his pupil response, asked him questions about his medical history and whether he'd taken any substances. And through it all, he just sat there on the bumper of the ambulance with that blanket around his shoulders and that distant look in his eyes. Finally, he blinked, seemed to come back to himself a little, and looked at the lead paramedic with something approaching recognition. "Is he gone?" Fontenot asked, his voice hoarse. "Did I leave him behind?" The paramedic, a woman named Chen, who I'd worked with on previous calls, looked at me and Boyd with a question in her eyes before turning back to Fontenot. "Sir, there's no one else here. It's just us. Can you tell me what medications you're taking, or if you've used any drugs or alcohol today?" Fontenot laughed, a broken sound that didn't have any humor in it, and shook his head. "I'm not drunk, and I'm not high. I know what I saw. I know what was sitting in my car," He was real. He was so real I could smell him, could smell the bayou water and the rot, and he kept telling me he just wanted to go home, kept asking me to drive him home. He looked past Chen to where his sedan still sat on the shoulder, driver's door still open, and his whole body tensed. Is he still in there? Is he waiting for me to come back? Boyd made the decision to have the vehicle towed rather than letting Fontenot drive it. Said he'd arrange for someone to take him home to Lafayette once EMS had cleared him, and Fontenot nodded gratefully like this was the best news he'd heard all night. While we waited for the tow truck, I did a thorough search of the sedan, checked the trunk and under the seats and in every compartment, looking for anything that might explain what had happened. I found nothing unusual, just the normal detritus of someone's daily life. Receipts and coffee cups and a phone charger, but when I sat in the driver's seat to check if the vehicle would start, I felt this coldness that had nothing to do with temperature. Felt like I was sitting in a pocket of air that had been in shadow for a very long time. I got out of that vehicle faster than I'd gotten into it, and I caught Boyd watching me with an expression that suggested he'd seen the same reaction from other people in other situations. That look of recognition when something trips your instincts in a way that can't be explained by training or experience. You felt it too, he said, and it wasn't a question. I nodded, and he gestured for me to follow him back to his cruiser. Pulled up the thermal footage from his camera and played it back on the screen. There it was, that second heat signature in the passenger seat, visible for the first few minutes after we'd arrived before it had faded gradually, like whatever was generating the heat had moved or dissipated or simply stopped existing in a way our equipment could detect. I've worked this stretch of Highway 31 for 23 years, Boyd said quietly, his eyes on the screen. And I've had maybe a dozen calls like this one. People saying they picked up a passenger who wasn't there. People who saw someone standing on the side of the road and stopped to help, only to have them vanish. Most of the time it's just folks who've been driving too long or who've had too much to drink. But sometimes, he paused, seemed to be choosing his words carefully. Sometimes the thermal shows what the eyes can't see, and you have to decide whether you believe your equipment or you believe the world works the way you were taught it works. I asked him what he thought it was, this thing that showed up on thermal cameras but not to the naked eye, and he shrugged in that way cops do when they've learned that some questions don't have good answers. Could be residual heat from the previous passenger, could be a glitch in how the camera processes certain environmental conditions. Could be that there are things walking around this bayou that we don't have names for or explanations for. He closed the camera display and looked out at the darkness beyond our lights. My grandfather used to say that the bayou keeps its dead close, that the water here is so old and has held so many bodies over so many years that sometimes they get confused and try to come back, try to find someone living to help them finish whatever business they left undone. The tow truck arrived and took Fontenot's sedan away, and one of the deputies gave Fontenot a ride back to Lafayette while I stayed to write up my report of the incident. I sat in my cruiser with my laptop open and tried to find the right words to describe what had happened. Tried to frame it in a way that wouldn't make me sound insane or get me flagged for a psychological evaluation. And eventually, I settled for the facts without the interpretation. Stopped vehicle for erratic driving. Driver displayed signs of mental distress and reported hallucinations. EMS called and patient transported for evaluation. Vehicle towed for safety reasons. Nothing about thermal signatures or heat patterns or the feeling of cold emptiness that had settled into my bones when I'd sat in that driver's seat. Boyd came by before he left, leaned in my window, and told me I'd handled the situation well. Told me that sometimes the job requires you to encounter things that don't fit in the boxes we're given for categorizing the world. You file your report, you go home, you don't talk about it except with people who've seen the same things, he said. And if you ever get another call like this one, you remember that whatever's out there on these roads at night, it can't hurt you as long as you don't let it in. Fontenot made the mistake of inviting it into his vehicle, made the mistake of offering help to something that shouldn't be helped, and that's where things went wrong for him. I asked him how you're supposed to know the difference between someone who needs help and something that looks like it needs help, and he smiled grimly. You listen to your instincts, you pay attention to that voice in your head that tells you something's wrong, and you never, ever invite anything into your vehicle or your home unless you're absolutely certain you know what it is. He straightened up and knocked twice on the roof of my cruiser. Finish your report and head home, Gautreaux. Get some sleep and try not to think about it too much, because thinking about it is what makes it worse. I took his advice and finished the report, stripped it down to the barest facts and submitted it to the system, then spent the rest of my shift driving the regular routes through St. Martin Parish and trying not to look too closely at the shadows under the live oaks or the places where the tree line met the water. Every vehicle I passed got a second look. Every person I saw standing on the side of the road got my full attention, and I found myself running my thermal camera more frequently than I normally would, checking and rechecking to make sure the heat signatures matched what my eyes were seeing. Dawn was breaking over the bayou by the time I finally headed back to the station, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that made the water look almost beautiful, almost peaceful, like you could forget what lived in those depths if you just didn't look too close. I clocked out and drove home with the windows down and the radio playing loud, trying to fill my head with sound and light and normal things, trying to push back against the memory of that cold emptiness and that heat signature that shouldn't have existed. But it stayed with me, settled into some corner of my mind where it sits even now, months later, waiting for the next time I work that stretch of Highway 31 at night. 2 weeks went by before I worked night shift again. 2 weeks of day patrol and paperwork, and trying to convince myself that what I'd experienced with Fontenot had been an equipment malfunction combined with a mentally disturbed driver. I almost succeeded in believing it too, almost managed to file the whole incident away under strange but explainable, until I got a call from Boyd asking me to meet him at a coffee shop in Breaux Bridge before my shift started. He was waiting at a corner table when I arrived, had a folder in front of him and an expression on his face that told me this wasn't a social meeting. I pulled the reports, he said without preamble, slid the folder across the table toward me. Every incident from the past 10 years involving that stretch of Highway 31 where someone reported picking up a passenger or seeing someone on the side of the road who then vanished, or who acted in ways that didn't make sense. I opened the folder and flipped through the pages, saw report after report written by different troopers and deputies, all describing similar encounters, all filed away as mental health issues or possible drug impairment or unexplained phenomena. There's been 17 documented cases, Boyd continued, and those are just the ones where someone actually called it in or where we responded to a call. How many more people had similar experiences and just drove away without reporting it? The pattern was clear once you saw it laid out this way. A cluster of incidents all occurring in roughly the same 3-mile stretch of road, all happening at night or in the early morning hours, all involving a passenger or figure that shouldn't have been there. Some of the descriptions were eerily similar to what Fontenot had reported. People who said they'd picked up someone at a convenience store or gas station only to realize later that the passenger had never actually gotten out when they'd stopped, that they'd somehow been there the whole time without arriving. Others described seeing someone standing on the shoulder waving for help, stopping to assist, and finding no one there when they got out of their vehicles. "What's the common factor?" I asked Boyd, though I thought I already knew the answer. "Location," he confirmed. Everything happens between mile marker 12 and mile marker 15, that stretch where the old Chittimaka burial grounds used to be before they built the highway. My grandfather told me stories about that area, said the tribe considered it cursed long before white people ever came here, said the water there was bad and the spirits there were angry. He paused, took a sip of his coffee like he needed the caffeine to keep going. And every single one of these reports mentions water, mentions the smell of bayou water or wetness, or cold like being underwater. I went back through the reports with that lens, looking for references to water, and found them in almost every case. Witnesses saying the passenger they'd picked up smelled like they'd been swimming in the bayou, or that their clothes were wet even though it hadn't rained, or that water seemed to be dripping from their hair onto the upholstery. One report from 3 years ago described a driver who'd picked up what he thought was a teenage boy hitchhiking, only to realize halfway through the drive that water was pooling on the floor of his passenger side was actually flowing like a slow leak, even though all the windows were closed and there was no visible source for it. There was a drowning there in 1987, Boyd said, pulling another document from his folder. Kid named Thibodeau's, 17 years old, went swimming in the bayou with some friends and got caught in the current. They never found the body. Water was too deep and the current took him downstream toward Charenton. But his mother swore she saw him walking along Highway 31 for years after. Swore she'd see him standing on the shoulder trying to thumb a ride home. He showed me a newspaper clipping yellow with age, showed me a grainy photo of a teenage boy with shaggy hair and a wide smile, and I felt that cold finger of unease trace down my spine again. "You think Fontenot picked up a ghost?" I said, trying to make it sound ridiculous, trying to make it sound like something we could both laugh about and dismiss. But Boyd didn't laugh, just looked at me with those steady eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. "I think Fontenot picked up something that used to be a person, something that's been trying to get home for 37 years and hasn't figured out yet that home doesn't exist anymore, that everyone it knew has moved on or died or forgotten about it." He closed the folder and pushed it across the table to me. "And I think it's still out there, still standing on that road, waiting for someone to stop and offer help." I asked him what we were supposed to do about it. How you're supposed to patrol a road when you know there's something on it that can appear on thermal cameras but not to the naked eye. Something that can get into people's vehicles and make them drive erratically and eventually run off into the woods in terror. Boyd finished his coffee and stood up, gestured for me to follow him outside. "You do your job," he said simply. "You patrol that road, you run your traffic stops, you help the people who actually need help. But you also pay attention, you trust your equipment when it shows you something your eyes can't see. And you don't stop for anyone standing on the shoulder between mile markers 12 and 15 unless you're absolutely certain they're solid and real and not leaving wet footprints on dry pavement." We stood in the parking lot of that coffee shop while the sun finished setting. Stood there while the light drained out of the sky and the first stars became visible overhead. And Boyd told me one more thing before he let me go start my shift. "The Chittimaka have a word for places like this," he said quietly. "Places where the boundary between what's living and what's dead gets thin and things can slip through from one side to the other. They call them thin places, and they teach their children to recognize them and avoid them when possible, because once you've walked through a thin place, you carry some of it with you, carry some of that boundary-crossing ability or awareness, or whatever you want to call it." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something like sympathy in his expression. "You've walked through a thin place now, Gautreau. You've seen what's on the other side, even if you didn't see it directly, even if it was just a heat signature on a camera screen. And that means you're going to see more of it going forward, going to notice things other people don't notice, going to be more aware of when the boundary is thin and something's trying to push through. That's not a curse, and it's not a gift, it's just how it works, and the sooner you accept it, the easier your job is going to be. I drove my patrol route that night with Boyd's words echoing in my head, drove past mile marker 12, and felt my whole body tense even though there was nothing visible on the side of the road. Nothing my eyes could detect. But my thermal camera picked up something, picked up a heat signature standing just at the tree line, human-shaped and motionless while all the other heat sources in the area moved and shifted with the natural rhythm of the bayou at night. I slowed down, aimed my spotlight at the location where the thermal was showing the figure, but saw nothing in the beam except trees and underbrush and the reflective eyes of an animal that might have been a deer or a coyote. I didn't stop, didn't pull over to investigate, just noted the location and time in my log, and kept driving, kept moving through that 3-mile stretch until I was past mile marker 15 and into the normal world again, where the only things on the side of the road were the things that were supposed to be there. But I checked my thermal camera obsessively for the rest of that shift, checked it every few minutes like I was afraid I'd miss something, and 3 more times before dawn, I caught signatures that didn't match what my eyes could see. Shapes that appeared on the screen but not in the wash of my spotlight or headlights. Sonny Bro came back to work a few days later, recovered from whatever stomach bug had kept him home, and I partnered with him for a night shift that took us along Highway 31 right through that section between mile markers 12 and 15. I didn't tell him about the reports Boyd had shown me or about the heat signatures I'd been seeing, didn't want to sound like I'd lost my grip on reality, but I must have been acting different because he noticed and asked if everything was okay. I told him I was fine, just tired, and he accepted that with the easy camaraderie of a longtime partner who knows when to push and when to let things go. We were driving past mile marker 13, deep in the tunnel of live oaks where the branches overhead blocked out even the moonlight, when Sonny suddenly grabbed my arm and pointed at the shoulder ahead. "You see that?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Someone's standing there. Looks like they need help." I hit my brakes and trained my spotlight on the location he'd indicated. Saw nothing in the beam except empty pavement and trees, but when I glanced at my thermal camera screen, I saw it. Saw a heat signature standing exactly where Sonny had pointed, a human-shaped pattern of warmth that was visible on the screen but invisible to our direct vision. "There's nothing there," I told Sonny carefully, watching his face to gauge his reaction. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind, pointed emphatically at the shoulder. "Are you blind? There's someone right there. Looks like a kid, might be injured or lost." He reached for the door handle and I grabbed his wrist hard enough to make him wince. "Don't get out," I said, and the urgency in my voice must have gotten through to him because he stopped, hand still on the handle, but not pulling it. "Trust me on this, Sonny, there's nothing there, or if there is something there, it's not something we want to approach." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him trying to process what I was saying, trying to reconcile what his eyes were telling him with what I was telling him. Finally, he looked back at the shoulder, looked at the spot where he'd seen the figure, and I watched his face change as he saw it the way I was seeing it, saw the wrongness underneath the appearance of normalcy. "It's not moving," he said slowly. "It's just standing there, not waving or trying to flag us down, just standing. And I can't quite focus on it. Every time I try to look directly at it, my eyes kind of slide off like it's covered in oil or something." I showed him the thermal camera screen, showed him the heat signature that was clear and distinct and undeniably human-shaped, and watched his face go pale in the green glow from the display. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, and I didn't have a good answer for him. Didn't have any answer except the truth. "Something that shouldn't be there," I said. Something that's been standing on this road for longer than either of us have been alive, waiting for someone to stop. We sat there in the cruiser for another minute, both of us staring at that heat signature on the screen. And then I put the vehicle in drive and we left, drove past that spot with our eyes forward and our hands tight on our weapons, and neither of us looked back. Sonny and I didn't talk about what we'd seen for the rest of that shift, drove our route in silence except for the radio traffic. And when we finally clocked out at dawn, he caught my arm in the parking lot and asked me what we were supposed to do about it. "Do we report it?" he asked. "Do we tell someone that there's something standing on Highway 31 that shows up on thermal cameras but not to the naked eye? Something that's been there for decades trying to get people to stop?" I thought about Boyd and his folder full of reports. Thought about all those troopers and deputies who'd encountered the same thing and filed it away under unexplained phenomena, and I shook my head. "We noted in our logs," I told him. "We make sure other patrols know not to stop for anyone in that section unless they can confirm with dispatch that there's an actual call. And we hope that's enough." It wasn't enough. I knew that even as I said it. Knew that hoping wouldn't prevent the next driver from stopping to help what looked like a stranded motorist or a lost pedestrian. Wouldn't prevent them from letting something into their vehicle that they couldn't get rid of. But what else were we supposed to do? Shut down 3 miles of highway because of something that most people couldn't even see? Put up signs warning drivers not to pick up hitchhikers who might be ghosts? The world doesn't work that way. Doesn't have protocols for dealing with things that exist in the space between what's real and what's impossible. I went home that morning and tried to sleep but couldn't. Kept seeing that heat signature on my camera screen. Kept thinking about that teenage boy who'd drowned in 1987 and whose mother swore she saw him trying to hitchhike home. I pulled out my phone and did some research. Found the old newspaper articles about the drowning. Found a follow-up piece from 1995 about how the mother had died still believing her son would come home someday. There were quotes from her in the article, rambling statements about how she'd seen him dozens of times over the years, how he always looked the same age as when he died, how he never seemed to recognize her even when she stopped and called out to him. The next night I worked solo patrol again, and I made a point of driving that stretch of Highway 31 just after midnight. Made a point of running my thermal camera the whole way through. The heat signature was there at mile marker 13, right where we'd seen it before, standing motionless at the tree line like it was waiting for something. I pulled over maybe 100 yards past it and sat there with my lights on and my engine running. Sat there trying to decide if I was brave enough or foolish enough to do what I was thinking about doing. After maybe 5 minutes, I grabbed my flashlight and got out, walked back along the shoulder toward where the thermal had showed the figure, and with every step I took, I felt that cold sensation getting stronger. Felt like I was walking into water that got deeper and colder the further I went. When I got to the spot where the thermal had indicated the presence, I stopped and swept my flashlight across the trees and the ground, looking for any physical evidence of what I was detecting, looking for footprints or disturbed vegetation or any sign that something had been standing here. Nothing. Just undisturbed leaf litter and the normal sounds of the bayou at night, frogs and insects and the distant call of an owl. But the cold was intense now. Was making my breath visible in the beam of my flashlight even though the temperature was still in the 70s, and when I looked down at my feet I saw them. Saw the wet footprints appearing on the dry pavement, one after another in a trail that led from where I was standing toward the tree line, and then back again like something had been pacing, had been walking back and forth along this section of road for so long that even its invisible footsteps left marks. I backed up quickly, my flashlight beam jerking across the darkness, and that's when I heard it. Heard that voice that Fontenot had described, that underwater sound like someone trying to speak through a mouth full of bayou water. "Help me," it said. the words barely intelligible, but the desperation in them unmistakable. "Help me get home. I've been trying to get home. I just want to go home." I stood there frozen, my light aimed at the tree line where the voice was coming from, and for just a moment I saw it. Saw the outline of a figure standing there. A teenage boy with shaggy hair and wet clothes, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my chest tight. "I can't help you," I said out loud, my voice sounding strange and thin in the heavy night air. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you get home. Home doesn't exist anymore. Your mother died years ago, and there's no one waiting for you." The figure flickered like a bad television signal, its outline blurring and then sharpening again, and I could see its mouth moving, could see it trying to speak, but no sound coming out except that underwater whisper. "Please," it said. The words stretched and distorted. "Please, I just need a ride. I just need someone to take me back. I'll show you the way. I remember the way." I should have run then. Should have gotten back in my cruiser and driven away and never come back to this stretch of road again. But something in that pleading voice kept me rooted in place, kept me staring at that flickering figure and trying to understand what I was seeing. "You drowned in 1987, I told it. Told him. Told whatever fragment of Thibodeau was still wandering this road 3 decades after his death. You died in the bayou, and your body washed downstream, and your mother looked for you until the day she died, but she never found you. You can't go home because there's no home left to go to." The figure solidified then, became clear and distinct for just a moment, and I saw his face properly for the first time, saw the teenage boy from the newspaper photo with water streaming from his hair and his clothes, saw his eyes that were the same brown as the bayou water he'd died in. He looked at me with an expression of such profound loss and confusion that I felt it like a physical weight on my chest, felt the full measure of what it meant to be trapped between one state and another, unable to move forward or back, unable to understand that the world he'd known had moved on without him. "I don't remember drowning," he said, and his voice was clearer now, more human, though still with that underwater quality. "I remember swimming, remember the current pulling me under, remember the water filling my lungs, but then I was here, standing on this road, and I thought someone would come get me, thought my mom would come looking for me. But everyone just drives past, or if they stop, they look right through me like I'm not there, like I'm invisible, and I can't understand why no one will help me get home." I didn't know what to say to that. Didn't have words for the tragedy of a spirit so confused and lost that it didn't even know it was dead. Didn't know that it had been standing on this road waiting for rescue for over 30 years. "You need to let go," I tried, though I had no idea if that was the right thing to say or if it would even make a difference. "You need to stop waiting for someone to take you home and accept that you're not going back, that the only direction you can go is forward, into whatever comes next." He shook his head, water droplets flying from his hair and disappearing before they hit the ground. "I can't," he said desperately. I tried to leave, but I can't. I'm stuck here, stuck to this road, and the only time I can move is when someone stops and lets me into their vehicle, when someone invites me in. Then I can ride with them, can feel the motion and the distance, can almost remember what it was like to be alive and going somewhere. But they always figure out something's wrong, always panic and make me get out, and then I'm back here again, standing on this shoulder waiting for the next person who'll stop. That explained Fontenot, explained all those reports Boyd had shown me, explained why drivers would pick up what looked like a stranded person and then gradually realize they'd invited something impossible into their vehicle. Thibodeau wasn't trying to hurt anyone, wasn't malicious or dangerous. He was just desperately trying to move, to break free from the spot where he'd first appeared after drowning, and the only way he could do it was by getting people to let him into their vehicles without realizing what he was. "I'm sorry," I told him, and I meant it. Meant it more than I'd meant almost anything else in my life. "I'm sorry you're trapped here, and I'm sorry I can't help you. But I can't let you into my cruiser, and I can't take you anywhere because I don't think it would help. I think it would just make things worse for both of us." He looked at me with those bayou water eyes, and I saw acceptance there. Saw him understand on some level that I was telling the truth, that there was no help coming, and there never would be. "Then tell people," he said, his voice fading as his outline started to blur again. "Tell people not to stop. Tell them to keep driving past this spot. Tell them that the boy on the side of the road doesn't need help, because the boy on the side of the road is already gone." And then he was gone too, dissolved back into the darkness and the fog, leaving nothing behind except those wet footprints on the pavement that faded even as I watched them. I walked back to my cruiser on shaking legs and sat in the driver's seat for a long time before I could trust myself to drive. Sat there while the cold slowly leached out of my bones and the normal sounds of the bayou crept back in to replace the underwater whispers. Finally, I keyed my radio and called dispatch, asked them to note in the log that Highway 31 between mile markers 12 and 15 should be flagged for increased patrol attention, that drivers had been reporting strange sightings in that area and we needed to maintain awareness. The dispatcher acknowledged and logged the note, and I put the cruiser in drive and finished my shift with my hands tight on the wheel and my eyes constantly checking the thermal camera screen for heat signatures that shouldn't be there. I've driven that stretch of road hundreds of times since that night, driven it with partners and driven it solo, driven it in daylight and in the deep hours after midnight, and every time I see him on the thermal camera, see that heat signature standing at mile marker 13, waiting for someone to stop. I don't stop anymore, don't even slow down, just note it in my log and keep moving. And I've made sure every trooper in my unit knows not to stop there either, unless they can confirm with the dispatch that there's an actual emergency. But I can't stop everyone. Can't prevent every motorist who sees what looks like a stranded teenager from pulling over to offer help. Can't be there every time someone makes the mistake of inviting Thibodeau into their vehicle and then discovering too late that they've let something in that won't leave willingly. All I can do is patrol that road, watch that heat signature on my camera, and hope that someday he figures out how to let go, how to move forward into whatever comes after death, instead of staying trapped in that terrible in-between state where he exists but doesn't live, where he can be seen but can't be helped. Sonny asked me last week if I thought Thibodeau would ever find peace, if there was anything we could do to help him move on from that spot where he's been waiting for over 30 years. I told him I didn't know, told him that whatever rules govern things like ghosts and spirits and the spaces between life and death are beyond my understanding or jurisdiction, that the best we can do is bear witness and try to prevent others from falling into the same trap. He accepted that answer, but I could see it bothered him. Could see him struggling with the same questions I've been struggling with since that night I stopped and talked to a dead boy on the side of the road. The truth is, I don't know if Thibodeau will ever be free of Highway 31. Don't know if there's any way to break whatever tether keeps him bound to that spot where he first climbed out of the bayou water dripping wet and confused and looking for home. All I know is that he's there still, standing at the tree line watching the cars go past, waiting for someone to stop and offer the help he's been seeking for decades. And all I can do is keep driving past, keep warning others away, and hope that my refusal to stop, my refusal to invite him in, doesn't condemn him to stand there forever waiting for a rescue that will never come. Some nights, when I'm lying awake at 3 in the morning, unable to sleep because I keep seeing those bayou water eyes and hearing that underwater voice. I wonder if I made the right choice. Wonder if I should have let him into my cruiser and driven him wherever he wanted to go. Driven him until he figured out for himself that there was no home to return to, that his mother was dead and his friends had moved on and the world he remembered didn't exist anymore. Maybe that would have given him closure, would have let him finally accept his death and move beyond it. But I didn't do that. And I won't do that because Boyd was right when he said you don't invite things into your vehicle unless you're absolutely certain you know what they are. And I'm not certain about anything anymore except that the boundary between living and dead is thinner on Highway 31 than it is most places, and walking through thin places changes you in ways you can't predict or control. I'm changed now. I can see things I couldn't see before. Can detect presences that exist just outside the normal range of human perception. And I don't know if that's a gift or a curse, or just the price you pay for doing this job long enough to encounter the things that hide in the margins of the world. So I keep patrolling, keep driving that 3-mile stretch of road where a boy drowned in 1987 and never found his way home. Keep watching my thermal camera for the heat signature that appears at mile marker 13 every night without fail. And I tell anyone who will listen not to stop for hitchhikers in that section, not to pick up stranded pedestrians, not to offer help to anyone standing on the shoulder between mile markers 12 and 15. Because help is what Thibodeau wants, help is what he's been begging for since the day he died. But help is the one thing that won't save him, the one thing that will only trap him more firmly in the space between life and death where he's been wandering for over 3 decades. Turn away from the boy on the side of the road. Keep driving when you see him standing there dripping wet with his thumb out and desperation in his eyes. Don't stop. Don't slow down. Don't make the mistake of thinking you can help him find his way home. Because home is gone, has been gone for longer than some of you have been alive, and all you'll do by stopping is give him another brief moment of motion and hope before he's back at that mile marker waiting for the next person, the next vehicle, the next chance to move, even though he'll never get where he's trying to go. That's all I've got to tell you about Highway 31 and the passenger who isn't there. That's all I can tell you without sounding like I've lost my mind or compromised my ability to do this job. File it away with all the other strange reports from this parish, all the other encounters with things that exist in the spaces our procedural manuals don't account for. And remember it if you ever find yourself driving through that tunnel of live oaks on a foggy night. Remember to check your thermal camera. Remember to trust your instincts when something feels wrong. And remember that offering help to the wrong person can trap them and you in ways that can't be easily undone. And if you see him standing there, if you catch a glimpse of a teenage boy with shaggy hair and wet clothes trying to flag you down, just keep driving. Keep your eyes forward and your hands on the wheel and don't look back. Because looking back means you've already stopped in your mind, already started the process of inviting him in, and once you've done that, it's almost impossible to undo. Just keep driving until you're past mile marker 15 and back in the normal world where the dead stay dead, and the only passengers in your vehicle are the ones you can see with your naked eyes. That's my warning. That's my testimony. And that's all I can give you except this one final piece of advice. The bayou keeps its secrets, and sometimes secrets are kept for good reasons. Don't go digging into them. Don't go trying to solve mysteries that have been unsolved for decades, because some mysteries remain unsolved because they can't be solved, because the only resolution would be accepting that the world is stranger and more terrible than we want to believe. Accept the mystery, document what you can, warn who you can, and keep driving through the darkness hoping that whatever's on the side of the road stays there, instead of getting into your vehicle and asking you to take it home. The Calcasieu Swamp doesn't give up its secrets willingly. And in my 12 years patrolling the parishes that border it, I've learned to respect that about the place. Learned to understand that there are depths in that dark water, and shadows in those cypress stands that humans weren't meant to probe too deeply. The old Creole families, who've lived along the swamp's edges for generations, have their own rules about what you do and don't do when you venture into that wilderness. Rules that sound like superstition, until you've seen enough to know that superstition is sometimes just wisdom dressed in old clothing. Wisdom earned through hard experience and harder losses. It was the third week of November when Troy Arsenault called me about Ewell Boudreaux. Called me from his truck somewhere deep in the wildlife management area where cell service came and went like marsh gas, his voice cutting in and out of static as he tried to explain the situation. Troy worked as a game warden for Louisiana Wildlife and Fisheries, had been doing it for nearly 20 years, and I'd partnered with him on enough cases involving poaching and illegal hunting that I'd learned to trust his judgment. Learned to recognize when he was worried versus when he was just following up on routine complaints. The tone in his voice that morning told me this was the former. Told me something had him rattled in a way that didn't happen often with a man who spent half his life alone in swamp country. "Bo, I need you to meet me at the Cocodrie Landing boat launch," he said. The connection fuzzy, but his words clear enough. "I've got a missing hunter situation here and it's tracking wrong, tracking the same way the others tracked, and I don't like where this is headed." I told him I was 30 minutes out and would roll with lights to cut the time. Asked him if he'd notified search and rescue yet, and there was a pause before he answered. "Not yet. Wanted you to see the map first. Wanted someone else to confirm what I'm seeing before I call in the full response team and start a search that might not find what we're looking for." That should have been my first warning that this wasn't a standard lost hunter call. Should have told me that Troy had already reached conclusions he didn't want to voice over an open radio channel. But I was focused on logistics and response time. Focused on the practical details of organizing a search in terrain that could kill you in a dozen different ways if you didn't know what you were doing. The Calcasieu Swamp covered better than 30,000 acres of wetland, most of it inaccessible except by boat or airboat. Most of it a maze of channels and sloughs that all looked the same until you'd spent years learning the subtle variations in the vegetation and watercolor. Finding someone in there who didn't want to be found was hard enough. Finding someone who'd gotten themselves genuinely lost or injured was like hunting for a specific cypress tree in a forest of 10,000 that all looked identical. I made good time to Cocodrie Landing, found Troy waiting by his truck with a map spread across the hood and his satellite phone in his hand. The phone that Wildlife and Fisheries issued to wardens who worked areas too remote for normal cell coverage. He looked tired, looked like he'd been up most of the night, and when I got close enough I could see the tension around his eyes that confirmed my sense that something about this situation was bothering him more than a routine missing person should. "Talk to me," I said, leaning over the map to see what he'd been studying. "What makes this one different from any other lost hunter?" Troy pointed to a series of marks he'd made on the map. Small red X's that formed a rough line extending from the boat launch into the deeper sections of the swamp. "Ewell Boudreaux launched his boat here yesterday morning around 0500, told his wife he was going duck hunting and would be back by noon. When he didn't show up by 1800, she called it in, and I've been trying to track him using the pings from his cell phone." He tapped the last X on the map, the one that was furthest from the launch and deepest into the swamp. This is where his phone stopped moving. Stopped sending signals around 0730 yesterday. That's about 2.5 hours after he launched, which means he was heading pretty deep, pretty fast. Deeper than most hunters go for duck. I asked him what was wrong with that. Plenty of hunters like to get away from the crowds and find spots where the birds hadn't been pressured, and Troy shook his head slowly. "Look at the trajectory," he said, tracing the line of X's with his finger. He wasn't hunting, not really. not if you know how duck hunting works. He was moving straight into the swamp, barely stopping, just pushing deeper and deeper until his phone stopped pinging. And look where that last ping is. Look at the coordinates. He pointed to a section of the map that showed solid dark green, showed an area where the channels got narrow, and the cypress grew so thick that even in winter when the trees were bare, you could barely see the sky. I studied the map, studied the coordinates, and felt that familiar cold sensation start to build at the base of my spine. "That's near Dead Lake," I said, though it wasn't really a question. Troy nodded grimly. "That's right, at Dead Lake. Right at the section where the water sits still no matter which way the wind blows. Right at the place where we've lost 3 other hunters in the past 8 years. He pulled out another map, this one marked with different symbols, and spread it next to the first one. "Here's the last known locations of those 3 hunters, the ones we never found or only found pieces of, and you tell me if you see a pattern." The pattern was obvious once you saw it laid out. 3 different sets of coordinates that all clustered within maybe half a mile of where Boudreaux's phone had stopped pinging. 3 different dates spanning from 2016 to 2023, but all in late fall when the water was low and the hunting was supposed to be good. 3 men who'd gone into the swamp alone and hadn't come back out. 3 searches that had found abandoned boats and equipment, but no bodies. 3 families that had buried empty caskets or still waited for remains that the swamp had never released. And now maybe a 4th. Now Ewell Boudreaux following that same trajectory into that same section of the swamp where the water was still, and the cypress grew close, and something waited that didn't like to be found. "You're thinking this isn't an accident," I said quietly, watching Troy's face for confirmation. He stared at the maps for a long moment before answering, and when he spoke his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, like he was afraid of being overheard, even though we were alone in the parking area. "I'm thinking that there's something in Dead Lake that draws people in, something that makes experienced hunters abandon their normal patterns and push deep into terrain they should know better than to enter. I'm thinking those 3 hunters we lost didn't just get careless or unlucky. They were called somehow, pulled toward that spot. And now Boudreaux's following the same path and his phone's gone dark in the same location, and I'm supposed to believe it's coincidence." I asked him what he wanted me to do, what he thought a state trooper could add to a search and rescue operation that would normally be handled by wildlife and fisheries and maybe the parish sheriff's department. And Troy looked at me with an expression that was part desperation and part resignation. "I want you to come with me. Want someone who's seen the kind of things I've seen over the years. Someone who'll believe me when I say this isn't natural and isn't safe and needs to be approached with more caution than we'd use for a standard lost person search. I want backup who won't think I'm crazy when I tell them we need to be careful about how we approach Dead Lake, about what we might find when we get there." The smart thing would have been to tell him to call in the full search and rescue team, to let the professionals handle it with their boats and their dogs and their proper equipment for searching 30,000 acres of swamp. But I'd worked with Troy long enough to know he didn't scare easily, didn't call for help unless he genuinely thought he needed it. And something in his voice told me that this situation required a response that went beyond the standard protocols. So I nodded and told him I'd follow him in, told him to give me 5 minutes to call my dispatcher and let them know I'd be assisting wildlife and fisheries on a search operation in the Calcasieu Wildlife Management area. And he thanked me with a relief that confirmed I'd made the right choice, even if I didn't yet understand why. We took Troy's boat, a flat-bottomed aluminum john boat with a 40-horse outboard that could navigate the shallow channels and tight passages that larger boats couldn't handle. And we launched from Cocodrie Landing with the sun just starting to burn off the morning mist that hung over the water like smoke. Troy had the map in a waterproof case, had his satellite phone and his radio and his service weapon, and I'd brought my own gear, plus a first aid kit, and emergency supplies in case we found Boudreaux injured and needing immediate care. The plan was simple: follow the coordinates from the cell phone pings and try to track Boudreaux's path through the swamp. Look for signs of his passage or disturbance that might indicate where he'd left his boat or tried to navigate on foot. The water was dark that morning, darker than I'd expected even for the Calcasieu, and it reflected the overcast sky in a way that made it hard to judge depth or see submerged obstacles. Troy navigated by memory more than sight, guiding the boat through channels that were barely wider than our beam, ducking under low-hanging branches that dripped with Spanish moss and resurrection fern. We passed through sections of open water where lily pads covered the surface like a green carpet, passed through stands of cypress so dense the temperature dropped 10 degrees in the shade, and with each turn deeper into the swamp I felt that sensation growing, that feeling of being watched by something that existed just outside the range of normal perception. After maybe an hour of running, we reached the area where Boudreaux's phone had started pinging. Found his boat tied to a cypress knee at the edge of a narrow channel that led deeper into the swamp. The boat was a 16-foot aluminum V-hull with a small outboard, standard duck hunting setup, and it was empty except for a few decoys and a shotgun case. Troy cut our engine, and we drifted up next to it, and I could see him studying the scene with that careful attention he'd developed from years of reading sign and evidence. "He tied it properly," Troy said, pointing to the knot securing the boat to the tree. "That's a good clove hitch. Means he wasn't panicked or rushing when he left the boat. Means this was intentional. He wanted the boat secure while he went somewhere." I asked where he could have gone from here on foot. The water was too deep to wade, and the nearest dry ground was maybe a quarter-mile through dense cypress, but Troy just pointed to a game trail that led from the water's edge into the trees, a narrow path made by deer or hogs over years of use. "He followed that," Troy said with certainty. "Don't know why he would, don't know what he was tracking or looking for, but that's the only route he could have taken unless he swam, and nobody swims in this water. Not if they've got any sense." We secured our boat next to Boudreaux's and stepped onto the muddy bank, and I could see the footprints immediately. Could see the distinctive tread of hunting boots pressed into the soft earth heading into the trees. We followed the trail, moving slowly and carefully, and with each step deeper into the swamp, I felt the air getting heavier, felt that sense of being watched intensifying until it was almost physical, like pressure building behind my eyes. Troy had his hand on his sidearm, not drawn, but ready, and I noticed he was scanning the trees and the undergrowth with the kind of alertness you see in soldiers in hostile territory, the kind of hypervigilance that says danger is present even if you can't identify the source. The footprints continued along the game trail, always heading deeper, always moving toward the coordinates where Boudreaux's phone had stopped pinging, and after maybe 15 minutes of tracking we reached a small clearing where the trail opened up and the canopy above thinned enough to let in more light. That's where we found his phone, found it lying in the mud like it had been dropped or thrown. The screen cracked and dark, the case left from impact with the ground. Troy picked it up carefully and tried to power it on but got nothing. Battery dead or damage too severe to allow it to function, and he bagged it as evidence before we continued tracking. The footprints led out of the clearing on the far side, led toward a section of the swamp that I recognized from the maps as being right on the edge of Dead Lake, and I could hear water now, could hear that peculiar still silence that comes from water that doesn't move, that sits stagnant and dark and reflects nothing. We emerged from the tree line onto the shore of Dead Lake just as the sun broke through the clouds overhead, and the contrast between the bright light above and the dark water below was so stark it hurt to look at, made my eyes water and my head spin. The lake was maybe 200 yards across at its widest point, roughly circular, ringed by cypress trees that leaned toward the water like they were drinking from it or maybe drowning in it. The water itself was black. Not just dark, but genuinely black. Like oil or ink, and it was perfectly still. Not a ripple, or wave, or current disturbing the surface. And in the middle of that black water, maybe 50 yards from where we stood, there was a light. I've seen swamp gas before, seen the phosphorescent glow that methane makes when it bubbles up from decaying vegetation and ignites in the air. Seen foxfire and bioluminescent algae, and all the natural phenomena that people in these parishes have been mistaking for ghosts and spirits since before Louisiana was even a state. But the light on Dead Lake wasn't any of those things, wasn't anything I could explain with science or rational thought, and I could tell from the way Troy had gone rigid next to me that he was seeing it too, was seeing something that shouldn't exist floating above water that shouldn't be that still. The light was roughly spherical, maybe 3 feet in diameter, and it hung about 5 feet above the surface of the lake, suspended there without any visible means of support. It glowed with a cold white luminescence that reminded me of fluorescent tubes or LED panels, that artificial quality that natural light doesn't have. And it cast no reflection on the water below it, cast no shadows on the trees around it, just hung there radiating that sterile white glow into the darkness. As I watched it, I realized it wasn't quite stationary. It was drifting slightly, moving in a slow circle above the same point on the water, tracing a path maybe 10 feet in diameter, and there was something hypnotic about the motion, something that made it hard to look away once you'd focused on it. "That wasn't here the last time I searched this area," Troy said quietly, his voice tight with tension. "Last time I came through Dead Lake was maybe 6 months ago. Routine patrol checking for illegal traps. And there was nothing like this. Nothing at all unusual about the place except for how still the water was." He pulled out his satellite phone and took several photographs of the light, zoomed in as far as the phone's camera would allow, and I could see his hands shaking slightly as he worked. "This is new. This is connected to Boudreaux somehow. Has to be, because the timing's too perfect. His phone stops pinging near Dead Lake, and suddenly there's this light that wasn't here before." I asked him if he thought Boudreaux could still be out here, could be somewhere on the far side of the lake, or maybe in one of the hunting camps that dotted the swamp. And Troy lowered his phone and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I think Boudreaux went toward that light," he said slowly. "I think he saw it from the shore, just like we're seeing it now. And I think something about it made him want to get closer to it. Made him forget about duck hunting and common sense and all the warnings about Dead Lake that anyone who's lived in this parish their whole life should know." He pointed at the mud near our feet, at the boot prints that continued past where we were standing, at tracks that led directly to the water's edge and then vanished. I knelt down to examine the tracks more carefully, saw the deep impressions where Boudreaux had stood at the water's edge for some time, saw where he'd shifted his weight and turned, saw where he'd finally stepped into the water and the tracks disappeared beneath the black surface. "He walked in," I said, though I could barely believe it even as I voiced the observation. "He walked into water that's probably over his head, walked in wearing boots and heavy clothing, and there's no sign he came back out." I followed the shoreline in both directions, looking for exit tracks or disturbance that would indicate he'd made it across or turned back, but found nothing, just that single set of prints leading into the water and vanishing. Troy was quiet for a long moment, staring at that light hanging above the water, and when he finally spoke, his voice had a quality I'd never heard from him before. Something like fear mixed with resignation. "The other 3 hunters we lost, the ones who disappeared in this same area, we never found them because we were looking in the wrong places. We're searching the shoreline and the islands thinking they'd drowned or gotten injured and crawled somewhere to die. But they didn't drown in the traditional sense. They walked into the water toward something they saw, something that called to them, And they didn't come back because they couldn't come back. Because once the water closes over your head in Dead Lake, you're not in Louisiana anymore, you're somewhere else. That should have sounded insane. Should have been the kind of statement that makes you question someone's fitness for duty. But standing there on that shore looking at that impossible light hanging above that impossibly still water, I found that I believed him. Found that the explanation made more sense than any rational alternative I could construct. "We need to search the lake," I said, though I wasn't sure I wanted to do what I was suggesting. "We need to get a boat out there and see if there's anything under that light, anything that would explain what happened to Boudreaux and the others." Troy looked at me like I'd suggested we jump off a cliff, looked at me like I'd lost my mind. But after a moment, he nodded. We returned to our boat and maneuvered it through the narrow channel that connected to Dead Lake. Emerged into that circular expanse of black water with the light hanging above it like a malevolent star, and I felt every instinct I had screaming at me to turn around, to go back, to leave this place and never return. Troy felt it too. I could see it in the way he gripped the steering arm of the outboard, in the way his jaw was clenched so tight the muscles stood out. But neither of us said anything, both of us understanding that we'd come too far to turn back now, that we owed it to Boudreaux and his family to at least try to understand what had happened. As we got closer to the light, I could see it more clearly, could see that it wasn't perfectly spherical but slightly irregular, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat, or breathing, expanding and contracting by inches in a rhythm that seemed to match my own pulse. The water beneath it was darker than the rest of the lake, was that deep black that suggests significant depth, and when I looked down into it I couldn't see the bottom, couldn't see any vegetation or fish or submerged logs, just darkness that went down forever. Troy cut the engine when we were maybe 20 yards from the light, let the boat drift on its momentum, and we sat there in silence watching it hang above us. "There's no wind," I said suddenly, realizing what had been bothering me about the scene beyond just the light itself. "Look at the trees. Look at the water. There's no wind at all, no movement, nothing." Troy looked around and I could see him registering what I was pointing out. Could see the realization settle over him like a weight. The air was perfectly still, not a breath of breeze, not a ripple on the water except for the gentle wake from our boat, and the Spanish moss hanging from the cypress trees on shore was motionless, hanging straight down like it had been frozen in place. Even in the deepest parts of the swamp, you usually got some air movement, some small current or thermal variation. But here there was nothing, just stillness so complete it felt unnatural. The light pulsed brighter, drew my attention back to it, and I found myself staring at it again, found my mind starting to drift in a way that felt wrong, felt like something was pulling at my thoughts and trying to reshape them. I could hear something now, something that wasn't quite sound but wasn't quite silence either. A frequency at the edge of perception that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. Next to me, Troy had gone slack, his hand loosening on the steering arm, his eyes fixed on the light with an expression of blank fascination, and I realized with a jolt of alarm that we were in danger. That whatever the light was, it was doing something to us, was pulling at us the same way it had pulled at Boudreaux and the others. "Troy," I said sharply, reached over and grabbed his shoulder, shook him hard enough to break whatever trance he'd fallen into. He blinked and jerked like he was waking from sleep, looked at me with confusion and then growing alarm as he realized what had almost happened. "We need to leave," he said, his voice rough. "We need to get out of here now before we end up like the others. Before that thing gets hold of us and we walk into the water thinking we're going somewhere safe or important or necessary." He yanked the starter cord on the outboard, and the engine roared to life, shattering that oppressive stillness, and he swung the boat around, heading back toward the channel that would take us away from Dead Lake. As we retreated, I looked back over my shoulder at the light, saw it hanging there above the water, saw it pulse once more like it was acknowledging our escape. And I could have sworn I saw something beneath it, something dark and massive moving in those black depths, something that made the light seem small and insignificant by comparison. But then we were into the channel and the trees closed behind us and the light was gone, hidden by the cypress in the distance, though I could still feel its presence like a pressure at the base of my skull. We didn't speak during the trip back to the launch, both of us processing what we'd seen and felt, both of us trying to figure out how to report an experience that defied rational explanation. When we finally reached Cocodrie Landing and had the boat secured, Troy called his supervisor and reported Boudreaux as a missing person requiring full search and rescue deployment. But he didn't mention the light, didn't mention the tracks leading into the water, or the sense of wrongness that permeated Dead Lake. "They'll search the area," he told me after he'd hung up. "They'll bring dogs and boats, and maybe even helicopters if the weather cooperates. But they won't find him. Same as they didn't find the others, because Boudreaux isn't lost in the traditional sense. He's gone in a way that searching won't help." I asked him what he thought we should do, whether we should tell the search teams about what we'd seen, about the light and the still water and the way it had pulled at our thoughts, and he shook his head firmly. They wouldn't believe us, would think we'd gotten heat exhaustion or were making excuses for a failed search. And even if they did believe us, what good would it do? You can't search for someone who's walked into another dimension or been taken by something that lives in the deep water. You can't rescue someone from a place you can't even define, let alone navigate to. He paused, stared out at the swamp that stretched away in all directions, dark and ancient and keeping its secrets. "Best we can do is document what we saw, keep records in case there's a pattern someone smarter than us can figure out someday, and warn people away from Dead Lake if we get the chance." The official search for Ewell Boudreaux lasted 5 days. Involved 24 volunteers from the parish along with professional search and rescue teams from wildlife and fisheries and the Coast Guard, and found exactly nothing except his boat tied to that cypress knee where we'd found it, and his phone lying in the mud in that clearing. They dragged sections of Dead Lake with hooks and sonar, found the bottom was deeper than anyone expected, dropped down maybe 40 feet in the center with sides that sloped gradually from the shore, but found no body, no equipment, no sign that anyone had drowned there recently or ever. The water was tested and found to be slightly acidic from organic decay, but otherwise normal. The trees were surveyed and found to be healthy cypress and tupelo, and the wildlife cameras set up around the lake showed normal animal activity, deer and raccoons and wading birds, but no human presence after Boudreaux had walked into the water. I attended the search briefings as liaison from Louisiana State Police, kept my observations about the light to myself as Troy had advised, and watched the frustration build among the searchers as each day passed with no new evidence. Boudreaux's wife came to the launch on the 3rd day, a small woman in her 50s with red-rimmed eyes and a desperate hope that made my chest ache. And I had to tell her that we'd found her husband's boat and phone, but not him, had to watch that hope crumble into grief and confusion as she tried to understand how someone could vanish so completely in a swamp that had been searched by hundreds of trained professionals. "He was a good swimmer," she told me, her voice breaking. "Grew up fishing these waters, knew the swamp better than he knew our neighborhood. There's no way he just drowned or got lost. No way he wouldn't have found his way back if he was able." I didn't know what to tell her. Couldn't give her the truth about what Troy and I had seen. Couldn't explain that her husband had walked into water that led somewhere else. So I defaulted to the standard responses about how the swamp was dangerous and unpredictable, about how even experienced hunters could have accidents. And I watched her not believe me, watched her see through the platitudes to the confusion and uncertainty underneath. On the 5th day, the official search was scaled back to an ongoing missing person investigation. The volunteers were thanked and sent home, and the professional teams moved on to other emergencies and other searches. Troy and I met at a diner in Sulphur, sat in a back booth away from the other customers, and tried to figure out what our next move should be. "I want to go back," Troy said quietly, stirring sugar into coffee he wasn't drinking. "Want to go back to Dead Lake and see if the light's still there. See if there's anything we missed, anything that might help us understand what happened." I should have told him it was a bad idea. Should have argued that we'd nearly been caught by whatever effect the light had, and going back was asking for trouble. But I found myself nodding agreement because I wanted the same thing, wanted answers to questions I couldn't properly articulate. We planned it carefully, waited until the search teams had fully withdrawn from the area, and then went back to Dead Lake at dawn 3 days after the official search had been suspended. The swamp was quiet as we navigated the channels, quieter than it should have been, like even the normal wildlife had learned to avoid this section, had learned that Dead Lake was a place where things went in and didn't come out. We approached the lake from the same direction as before, emerged from the channel into that circular expanse of black water, and saw immediately that things had changed. The light was still there, still hanging above the water, but it was lower now, was maybe only 2 feet above the surface instead of 5. And it was pulsing more slowly, more deliberately, like a heartbeat that was winding down. The water beneath it was disturbed, not waves exactly, but more like the water was bulging upward, was forming a low mound directly under the light as if something was pushing from below. Troy cut the engine and we drifted, watching this phenomenon from a safe distance, and I could see his hand on his sidearm, could see him thinking about drawing it, even though we both knew a gun wouldn't help against whatever this was. "Look at the shore," Troy said, pointing toward the muddy bank where we'd found Boudreaux's footprints. I followed his gesture and felt my stomach drop, felt that cold sensation spread through my chest and down my arms. The mud was different now, was disturbed in a pattern that hadn't been there before, bulges and depressions that looked almost like something had pushed up from underneath, like the ground itself had heaved and settled in response to some subsurface movement. And, in the center of the disturbed area, directly in line with where Boudreaux's tracks had entered the water, there was a depression, a hole maybe 3 feet across that went down into the mud and disappeared into darkness. "Something came up," I said, though I didn't want to believe what I was suggesting. "Something came up out of the ground or the water and left that mark, left that hole." Troy was already pulling out his satellite phone, was taking photographs of the shore and the hole and the light above the water, documenting everything with a methodical precision that suggested he was planning to use this evidence for something, planning to build a case or make a report that would force someone to acknowledge what we were seeing. We maneuvered the boat closer to the shore, close enough that I could get out and examine the hole in the mud, and as I stepped onto that disturbed ground, I felt it. Felt the wrongness seeping up through the earth like cold water. Felt something vast and patient waiting below. The hole was deep, went down further than my flashlight beam could illuminate, and the sides were smooth, like they'd been bored rather than dug, like something cylindrical had pushed up through the mud and then retreated. I called Troy over and we both stared into that darkness, both trying to understand what could create a hole like this in ground that should have been fairly solid even this close to the water. "Throw something in," Troy suggested. "Drop a rock or a stick and see if we can hear it hit bottom." I found a piece of deadfall, a branch maybe 2 feet long, and dropped it into the hole. Watched it disappear into the darkness and waited for the sound of impact. Nothing. No splash, no thud, no indication that it had hit anything at all. Just silence that stretched on until we both accepted that the hole was deeper than it appeared, deeper than made sense given the geology of the area. I stepped back from it, suddenly worried about stability, suddenly imagining the ground giving way and dropping me into whatever waited below. The light above the water pulsed brighter, drew our attention back to it, and I saw something I hadn't seen before. Saw movement beneath it in those black depths, shapes that rose toward the surface and then sank again. Forms that were almost recognizable but not quite, like looking at something through distorted glass. Troy saw them too. I could tell from the way he'd gone rigid. Could tell from the way his hand had finally drawn his weapon, even though we both knew it was useless. "Those are people," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Those shapes in the water, those are people. They're the ones who walked in and didn't come back." I wanted to deny it, wanted to offer some other explanation for what we were seeing, but the shapes were becoming clearer as they rose closer to the surface, and I could see he was right. Could see the outline of human forms suspended in the water, could see arms and legs and heads, could see dozens of them hanging in the depths beneath that light like they were waiting for something, or maybe becoming something. And as I watched, one of the shapes rose higher than the others, rose until it broke the surface just below the light, and I saw with horror that it was wearing hunting clothes, saw the distinctive camouflage pattern of modern gear, saw a face that had been underwater for days, but was somehow still intact, still recognizable from the photographs his wife had shown us. "That's Boudreaux," I said, my voice shaking. "That's him right there. He's in the water, under the light. And he's not alone. There's others with him. The 3 hunters we lost and probably more that we don't know about. All of them in the water. All of them suspended there." The figure that was Boudreaux didn't move, didn't swim or thrash or show any sign of distress, just hung there in the water looking at nothing, and after a moment it sank again, descended back into the depths where the other shapes waited. Troy made a sound in his throat that might have been grief or horror or both, and he lowered his weapon with hands that shook so badly he nearly dropped it. "We can't help them," he said, his voice hollow. "We can't dive in there and pull them out. Can't even confirm that what we're seeing is real and not some kind of hallucination or mass hysteria." He turned away from the water, turned back toward the boat, and I could see that he was at the limit of what he could process, that he'd seen more than anyone should have to see and needed to leave before it broke him completely. We were loading back into the boat when the light flared so bright that it hurt to look at, and I heard something that I'll carry with me until the day I die. Heard voices calling from beneath the water. Dozens of voices, all speaking at once in words I couldn't understand, but that conveyed meaning anyway, conveyed invitation and hunger and patient waiting. The light held that brightness for maybe 5 seconds and then dimmed again, returned to its normal glow, and in the aftermath I could see that the water had settled. The mound had flattened, and the shapes beneath the surface were no longer visible. Troy started the engine, and we fled. Fled like cowards or like wise men, I wasn't sure which. Fled back through the channels toward the boat launch and civilization, and the world where things made sense and stayed dead when they died. We didn't talk about what we'd seen, didn't try to process or explain or rationalize, just ran from Dead Lake like it was chasing us, and maybe in some way it was. Back at Cocodrie Landing, we sat in Troy's truck and looked at the photographs he'd taken, looked at the images of the light and the disturbed mud, and the hole that went down into darkness, and tried to decide what to do with evidence that nobody would believe. Evidence that suggested something impossible was happening in a swamp that the state of Louisiana considered just another wildlife management area. "If we show these to anyone, they'll think we faked them," Troy said, scrolling through the images on his phone. "Or they'll think the equipment malfunctioned, or we'll get sent for psychological evaluation. Or worst case, they'll believe us and then want us to go back there with a full team and try to retrieve those bodies." I thought about that last possibility. Thought about what would happen if someone tried to dive into Dead Lake and pull out Boudreaux or any of the others we'd seen hanging in those depths. And I knew without knowing how I knew that it would be a disaster. that whoever went into that water would join the shapes beneath the light, would become another form suspended in the darkness, waiting for whatever the light portended. "We can't go back there," I said firmly. "And we can't let anyone else go there either. Not until we understand what's happening. Not until we've got some way to protect people from whatever effect that light has." Troy closed his phone and leaned back against the seat, closed his eyes like he was trying to shut out the memory of what we'd seen. "My grandfather told me stories about Dead Lake," he said quietly. "Told me the Kitamaka wouldn't go near it even before the white settlers came. Said they believed it was a doorway to the world beneath the world, a place where the spirits of the drowned waited for permission to return." He opened his eyes and looked at me. "I always thought those were just stories, just folklore meant to keep children from playing too close to dangerous water. But maybe they were warnings. Maybe the tribes knew something we've forgotten or never learned, knew that some places are doorways that need to stay closed." We sat in silence for a long time, watching the swamp through the truck's windshield, watching the light fade as evening approached and the shadows lengthened across the water. Finally, I asked him what he was going to tell Boudreaux's wife, what explanation he could give that wouldn't require admitting we'd seen her husband's body suspended in water he couldn't escape. Troy was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer, and when he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with resignation. "I'm going to tell her the truth as much as I can, that we found evidence he walked into the water at Dead Lake and didn't come back out, that the area is being monitored but the chances of recovery are minimal given the depth and conditions. I'm not going to tell her we saw him in the water, not going to give her that image to carry for the rest of her life. But I am going to tell her that he didn't suffer, that from what we could determine he walked in calmly and willingly, which is at least partially true even if the reasons for that willingness are something she can't know." I asked him if he was going to file a report about the light and the shapes in the water and the hole in the ground, and he shook his head slowly. "I'm going to file a report that says we searched Dead Lake thoroughly and found no evidence of Boudreaux except his abandoned boat and phone, that the water conditions and depth make it likely the body is submerged and may never be recovered. I'm going to recommend that the area be marked as hazardous and that hunters be discouraged from accessing that section of the management area, but I'm not going to include anything about lights or mysterious holes or bodies that don't float the way drowned bodies should." He looked at me then, his expression serious. "But I am going to keep these photographs, going to maintain a private file of everything we've seen and documented, and if we get another missing hunter in that area, if this pattern continues, I'm going to bring it to someone who has the authority and resources to do something about it, even if that means admitting we've been seeing things that can't be explained." 3 weeks passed before I went back to the Calcasieu swamp. 3 weeks of normal patrol and routine calls and trying not to think about what I'd seen beneath that light. But Dead Lake pulled at me, pulled at my thoughts when I was trying to sleep, showed up in my dreams as that cold white glow hanging above black water, and eventually I couldn't resist anymore. Had to go back and see if the light was still there. Had to know if what we'd witnessed was ongoing, or if it had been a temporary phenomenon connected specifically to Boudreaux's disappearance. I went alone this time, didn't tell Troy or anyone else where I was going, just launched my personal John boat at Cocodrie Landing early one morning and navigated the channels I'd memorized from our previous trips. The swamp was different in the early light, looked almost peaceful. Looked like the kind of place you'd want to bring your family fishing or your children to see the alligators and egrets. But as I got deeper, as I approached the area where Dead Lake lay hidden among the cypress stands, that sense of wrongness returned, that feeling of being watched by something vast and patient that existed just beyond the edge of perception. I emerged into Dead Lake and saw the light immediately. Saw it hanging above the water exactly where it had been before, but something was different now. Something had changed, in the 3 weeks since Troy and I had fled from this place. The light was brighter, was pulsing faster, and beneath it the water was moving, was actually rippling in perfect circles that expanded outward from directly under the light as if something was disturbing the surface from below. And on the shore, in that disturbed area of mud where we'd found the hole, there were more marks now, more depressions and bulges, patterns that looked almost intentional, almost like footprints but larger and deeper than any human foot could make. I cut my engine and drifted, watching the light pulse and the water ripple, and I realized with a cold certainty that this was accelerating, that whatever process had begun when Boudreaux walked into the water was continuing, was building towards something, and I understood with absolute clarity that I needed to leave, needed to warn people away from this place before whatever was happening reached completion. I started my engine and began backing away, keeping my eyes on the light, and that's when I saw them. Saw the shapes rising from the water again. More of them now than before, dozens of human forms suspended beneath the light and slowly, inexorably, rising toward the surface. I ran, pushed my engine to maximum throttle and fled through the channels back toward the landing. Fled from whatever was happening at Dead Lake, and I didn't look back until I'd reached the dock and had my boat secured. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely tie the knot, and my chest felt tight like I couldn't get enough air, and for the first time in my 12 years of law enforcement I felt genuine terror. Not the adrenaline surge of a dangerous situation, but the existential dread of having glimpsed something my mind couldn't process. Something that violated every assumption I had about how the world worked. I called Troy from the parking lot, told him I'd gone back to Dead Lake and what I'd seen, and there was a long silence on the other end before he finally spoke. "It's spreading," he said quietly. "Whatever's happening there, it's getting stronger, more active, and if it continues we're going to have more disappearances, more people walking into that water and not coming back." He paused, and I could hear him thinking, could practically feel him weighing options and considering outcomes. "I'm going to make some calls, going to reach out to some people in the State Cultural Preservation Office, people who study Native American sacred sites and might have some context for what we're dealing with. Maybe the Chitimaca have records or oral histories that explain Dead Lake. Maybe they know what it is and how to interact with it or avoid it." That was 6 months ago. Troy made his calls and found a few academics who were interested in the site. Found some tribal elders who confirmed that Dead Lake had been considered forbidden by their ancestors, but nobody had concrete answers about what it was or how to stop it. The light is still there. I know because I've been back a dozen times since then, have watched it from the shore through binoculars, have documented its changes and patterns, have counted the shapes in the water, and seen them multiply as more hunters go missing, as more people make the mistake of approaching that cold white glow and letting it pull at their thoughts and draw them in. Boudreaux's wife moved away from Calcasieu Parish, moved to Houston where she had family, and could start over somewhere that didn't remind her of her husband's disappearance every time she saw the swamp. I see her sometimes in my dreams, see her red-rimmed eyes asking me how someone could vanish so completely, and I still don't have an answer for her, still can't explain what happened in a way that would give her closure or peace. All I can tell her is that her husband walked into water that led somewhere else, walked toward a light that shouldn't exist, and became part of something we don't understand and can't fight. The official position of Louisiana Wildlife and Fisheries is that Dead Lake is experiencing unusually high levels of methane release due to organic decomposition, that the light reported by some visitors is swamp gas igniting in the air, and that the disappearances are tragic coincidences involving experienced hunters who made fatal errors in judgment. That's the explanation they give to the families, to the media, to anyone who asks why the search efforts keep failing and why the bodies never surface. And maybe they even believe it. maybe they've convinced themselves that natural phenomena can account for everything we've seen. But I know better. I know that something lives in Dead Lake, something that existed before the Kitamaka, and before the French, and before anyone thought to draw maps and give names to the waterways and islands of Louisiana swamp country. I know that it waits there beneath the black water, patient and hungry, drawing people toward that light with a call that can't be resisted once you've seen it up close. And I know that the shapes suspended in those depths aren't dead, aren't alive, aren't anything that fits into categories we have words for, and that someday, when whatever process is happening reaches completion, they're going to rise from the water, and whatever they've become will walk on land again. I keep Troy's photographs in a locked file in my personal storage, keep my own documentation and notes and observations, and I've started training other troopers and deputies about the signs that someone is planning to visit Dead Lake, the telltale patterns of behavior that suggest they've heard about the light and want to see it for themselves. I can't stop everyone, can't prevent all the disappearances, but I can intercept some of them, can turn them around before they launch their boats or follow the game trails into that section of the swamp. And when I can't intercept them, when someone else goes missing and another family has to bury an empty casket and try to move on without understanding what happened, I go back to Dead Lake and I watch from the shore as another shape joins the one suspended beneath the light, and I wonder how many more it will take before whatever's down there has what it needs, before the process reaches completion, and the doorway the Chitamaka warned about finally opens. The light pulses above the water, steady and patient, and the swamp keeps its secrets, and somewhere in those black depths, Ewell Boudreaux and dozens of others wait for something none of us can name or prevent. That's the truth of Dead Lake. That's the reality that exists alongside the official explanations and the rational denials. And it's a truth that gets harder to carry with each passing day, each new disappearance, each time I see that cold white glow in my dreams and wake up with the taste of swamp water in my mouth. Troy told me last week that he's retiring at the end of the year. Said he's spent enough time in the swamp and needs to move somewhere he can't see cypress trees from his kitchen window. I don't blame him, don't judge him for wanting to escape this place and everything it's shown us. But I also know I can't leave, can't abandon the people who depend on law enforcement to keep them safe, even when the threat is something we can't officially acknowledge or combat. So I'll keep patrolling these parishes, keep watching Dead Lake from a distance, keep maintaining that file of evidence that nobody else will look at or believe, and keep hoping that somehow, someday, someone smarter than me will figure out what that light is and how to close the doorway it's opening. Until then, if you're planning to hunt in Calcasieu Parish, if you're thinking about visiting the wildlife management area or launching a boat into those channels that wind through the cypress stands, do yourself a favor and stay away from Dead Lake. Don't go there even in daylight. Don't approach it even if someone tells you about a light they saw or a good fishing spot they heard about, because that place will pull at you, will call to you in ways you can't resist once you're close enough. And if you answer that call, you'll walk into the water and join the others, and you won't come back. The water's rising at Dead Lake, been rising imperceptibly for months now, the shoreline creeping further from where it used to be. The cypress trees that used to mark the water's edge now standing knee-deep in black stillness. Whatever's down there is expanding, reaching, growing stronger with each person it claims. And when the water gets high enough, when it reaches some critical threshold that only it understands, I think the light is going to change, is going to do something different, and whatever's been waiting beneath will finally emerge. I can't stop it. Troy can't stop it. Nobody can, because we're fighting something that exists outside the jurisdiction of human law or understanding, something that's been here longer than we have and will be here long after we're gone. All we can do is bear witness, document what we see, and warn anyone who'll listen to stay away from the places where the boundary between this world and whatever lies beneath gets thin. That's my account of what happened at Dead Lake. That's my testimony about the light and the water and the shapes that wait beneath. Believe it or dismiss it as you choose. But if you ever find yourself in Calcasieu Parish near the wildlife management area, and someone mentions they saw a strange light above the swamp, don't go looking for it. Don't follow the channels to Dead Lake. Don't approach that cold white glow. And don't listen if you hear voices calling from beneath black water that doesn't move. Just turn around and leave while you still can, while the choice is still yours to make. Because once you've seen the light up close, once you've felt it pull at your thoughts and invite you closer, the choice stops being yours and starts being something else's. And by then, it's already too late to save yourself from the water that's rising. Always rising, claiming one victim at a time until it has enough. Until whatever waits below can finally breach the surface and walk among us. The light burns on Dead Lake. The water rises. The drowned wait beneath. And somewhere in the Calcasieu swamp, something patient and vast and utterly alien continues its work. One disappeared hunter at a time. One family's grief at a time. Until the day when the doorway finally opens and we discover what's been waiting on the other side. I've been running patrol on State Route 182 through St. Mary Parish for going on 9 years now. And I can tell you that road has a rhythm to it, a pattern you learn after enough nights driving the same curves and straightaways between Franklin and Morgan City. You learn where the fishing camps cluster near the bayou, where the sugarcane fields give way to marshland, where the oak trees form that tunnel of branches that blocks out the stars. After 9 years you could drive it blind, could navigate by memory alone, and that's exactly what I thought I was doing on the night of February 11th, when I realized I'd been driving the same 5-mile stretch for 3 hours without ever reaching the end of it. It started normal enough, started with me clocking in at 2200 hours for the overnight shift, and getting my assignment from dispatch to run routine patrol along 182, checking for speeders and impaired drivers. The weather was typical for February in South Louisiana, cold enough that you needed a jacket, but not cold enough for frost, with a low fog settling over the marshes and creating that murky visibility where your headlights only cut maybe 50 feet before the world turns gray. I headed out from the station in Franklin, took 182 east toward Morgan City, and settled into the familiar rhythm of patrol, watching the shoulder for disabled vehicles and the road for anything unusual. Mile marker 37 was where I first noticed something was off. Noticed it because I'd just passed that marker maybe 10 minutes earlier, and here it was again. The same green sign with the same white numbers reflecting in my headlights. I slowed down and checked my odometer, confirmed I'd traveled exactly 5.2 miles since the last time I'd seen marker 37, which should have put me at marker 42 or 43, not back at 37 like I'd somehow circled around. I keyed my radio and called dispatch, told them I was having some confusion with my position and could they confirm my GPS coordinates. Dispatch came back with coordinates that placed me exactly at mile marker 37, exactly where the sign said I was, and asked if I was experiencing equipment problems or needed assistance. I told them negative, probably just got turned around in the fog, and I'd continue my patrol route. But I was paying attention now, was watching for landmarks I recognized, and over the next 15 minutes I passed the same abandoned gas station twice. The same hand-painted sign advertising fresh boudin, the same cluster of mailboxes at the entrance to a gravel road. Each time I thought I was making progress east toward Morgan City. Each time the mile markers and the GPS coordinates told me I was right back at marker 37. The third time I reached that mile marker, I pulled over onto the shoulder and sat with my engine running and my flashers on, trying to make sense of what was happening. The logical explanation was equipment failure, GPS glitching and giving me false position data. But the mile markers were physical objects bolted to posts, couldn't be faked by malfunctioning electronics. The other explanation was that I'd somehow gotten confused in the fog and was driving in circles. But I knew this road, knew it like I knew my own driveway, and there were no turnoffs or loops between marker 37 and Morgan City that would allow me to circle back without realizing it. I got out of my cruiser and walked to the mile marker, reached out and touched it to confirm it was real and solid, and felt the cold metal under my fingers, felt the raised numbers that identified this as marker 37. Behind me, the fog drifted across the road in layers, thick enough that I couldn't see more than 20 yards in any direction, and the silence was complete except for the idle of my engine and the distant sound of bullfrogs calling from the marsh. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, waiting for something to change or reveal itself, waiting for the fog to lift enough that I could see further down the road and confirm which direction I should be traveling. When I got back in the cruiser, I made the decision to turn around, to head back west toward Franklin and see if I could break whatever pattern had me trapped. I executed a 3-point turn on the empty highway, aimed my nose west, and started driving with my eyes locked on the mile markers counting down. 37 became 36, became 35, and I felt relief start to build in my chest. Felt like I'd figured out the problem and was escaping it. But then I reached what should have been marker 34 and instead saw 37 again, saw that same green sign with those same white numbers, and I understood with a cold certainty that I wasn't confused and my equipment wasn't malfunctioning. I was trapped in a 5-mile stretch of State Route 182 that I couldn't leave no matter which direction I drove, trapped in a loop that kept resetting me back to marker 37 every time I tried to escape it. The rational part of my mind was screaming that this was impossible, that roads don't work this way, that physics and geography and every law of nature said I should be able to drive east or west and eventually reach somewhere different. But the evidence was undeniable, was right there in front of me every time I passed that abandoned gas station or that hand-painted Boudin sign or that cluster of mailboxes. I tried calling dispatch again, tried to explain what was happening in a way that wouldn't make me sound insane or impaired. But the radio was acting strange now, was cutting in and out with static that made communication difficult. I could hear the dispatcher's voice asking me to repeat my transmission, could hear her saying my signal was breaking up and she was having trouble understanding me, and then the radio went completely dead, left me in silence with just the sound of my engine and that distant chorus of bullfrogs. I tried my cell phone and got no signal, tried the emergency satellite system in my cruiser and got nothing but error messages. I was alone on this stretch of road with no way to communicate and no way to leave, and the fog was getting thicker, was pressing in against my windows like something solid. I kept driving because stopping felt worse, kept moving through that gray tunnel of fog watching the same landmarks repeat over and over, and I started noticing details I'd missed before. The abandoned gas station always had its door hanging open at the same angle, always had that same blue tarp flapping on the roof where shingles had blown off. The Boudin sign was always exactly 47 degrees tilted to the left, always had that same rust stain in the lower right corner. The mailboxes were always in the same configuration, 3 black and 2 green, with the middle green one always leaning slightly forward. Everything was exactly the same each time I passed it, same down to the smallest detail, like I was watching a recording on loop rather than driving through physical space. And each time I completed the loop and found myself back at marker 37. I checked my watch and found that exactly 18 minutes had passed, exactly the same amount of time every single loop, like the universe was resetting itself to some fixed point and forcing me to experience the same 18 minutes of driving over and over. After the 7th or 8th loop, I stopped counting, stopped trying to make sense of the pattern. and just drove on autopilot while my mind raced through possibilities. Was I dreaming? Had I been in an accident and was unconscious somewhere, imagining this endless drive? Had I died without realizing it, and this was some kind of purgatory, condemned to patrol the same stretch of road forever? None of those explanations felt right. None of them matched the texture of what I was experiencing, the realness of the steering wheel under my hands, and the fog pressing against the windshield and the mile markers reflecting my headlights. Then I saw the other vehicle. It appeared in my rearview mirror maybe 4 loops after I'd stopped counting, appeared suddenly like it had materialized out of the fog rather than approaching from behind, and I watched it close the distance between us until it was maybe 50 yards back, matching my speed exactly. I couldn't make out the make or model through the fog, could just see headlights and the vague outline of a sedan, and I felt a spike of hope that maybe I wasn't alone in this loop. Maybe someone else was trapped here too, and we could figure out together what was happening. I slowed down to let the vehicle catch up, pulled over onto the shoulder near marker 37, and watched my mirrors waiting for it to pass or pull up alongside me. But the vehicle slowed when I slowed, maintained that same 50-yard distance, and after maybe 2 minutes of sitting there on the shoulder, I realized it wasn't going to approach, wasn't going to make contact, was just going to follow me, maintaining that exact distance. I tried flashing my lights at it, tried the siren for just a burst to get its attention, but it didn't react, just sat there in the fog with its headlights pointed at me. I pulled back onto the road and accelerated, watched the vehicle in my mirror accelerate to match my speed, watched it maintain that perfect 50-yard separation like we were connected by an invisible tether. For the next 3 loops it followed me, never getting closer or further away, never varying its behavior, and I started to understand that it wasn't another trapped driver, wasn't anyone who could help me or who I could help. It was part of the loop, part of the pattern, another element that had been added to the repeating 18 minutes I was experiencing over and over. The fog got thicker. I'm not sure when it started, not sure which loop it was when I first noticed that visibility was decreasing, but by the time I was aware of the change, I could barely see the road 10 feet ahead, could barely make out the mile markers as I passed them. The vehicle behind me was just a glow now, just 2 points of light that followed me through the gray, and I had to slow down to maybe 20 miles per hour to avoid driving off the road into the marsh that I knew flanked the highway, even though I couldn't see it anymore. That's when I heard the voice on the radio. Not dispatch, not any official channel, just a voice cutting through the static. A woman's voice speaking with a Cajun accent so thick I could barely understand the words. "Turn around," she said, the words stretched and distorted. "You're going the wrong way. You need to turn around before you reach the end." I grabbed the radio handset and tried to respond. Tried to ask who she was and what she meant by the wrong way, but got only static in return. Got only that voice repeating the same message over and over. "Turn around. Wrong way. Turn around." I ignored the voice and kept driving, kept pushing through the fog that was now so thick I could barely see my hood ornament. And that's when I noticed the road was changing. The asphalt was rougher now, was cracked and potholed like it hadn't been maintained in years, and the shoulder was starting to disappear, was being swallowed by marsh grass and standing water that crept closer with each passing minute. The mile markers were harder to read, were covered in rust and algae, and marker 37 looked like it had been standing in water for decades, even though I'd touched it just an hour ago and found it clean and dry. I drove 5 more loops and watched the road continue to deteriorate, watched it transform from maintained highway to something that looked abandoned, that looked like it had been reclaimed by the swamp over many years of neglect. The abandoned gas station was more collapsed now, was leaning at an angle that suggested it would fall completely with the next strong wind, and the Boudin sign was so faded I could barely make out the letters. The mailboxes were gone entirely, swallowed by marsh grass, and in their place was just a rusted post sticking up from standing water. The vehicle behind me was gone too, had disappeared at some point during the transformation without me noticing exactly when, and I was alone again in that deteriorating loop, driving through fog so thick it was like swimming through cotton. My cruiser's engine started running rough, started making sounds it shouldn't make, and when I checked my gauges they were all reading wrong, temperature too high, oil pressure too low, like the vehicle was aging along with the road, like both of us were decaying in real time. That's when I reached the end. After God knows how many loops, after hours of driving the same 18 minutes over and over, I came around a curve, and instead of seeing marker 37 again, I saw water. Saw the road disappearing beneath black water that stretched away into the fog. Saw my headlights reflecting off a flooded section of highway that shouldn't exist. I hit the brakes and slid to a stop maybe 10 feet from where the asphalt disappeared beneath the surface. Sat there with my engine running rough and steam starting to rise from under my hood. The water was perfectly still, was that same unnatural stillness I'd seen in other swamp situations. And it was dark, was black as oil despite the fact that swamp water is usually brown or green. And in the middle of that flooded section, maybe 30 yards from where I'd stopped, there was something floating, something that looked like a vehicle, looked like a police cruiser with its light bar still visible above the waterline. I got out of my cruiser with my flashlight and walked to the edge of the water, shined my light across the surface and confirmed what I was seeing. It was a cruiser, was an older model but still recognizable as Louisiana State Police, and it was sinking slowly, was settling into the black water like it had just driven in and gotten stuck. I could see someone in the driver's seat, could see the outline of a trooper sitting there with hands on the wheel, and I called out asking if they needed help. The figure didn't move, didn't respond, just sat there as the water rose past the door handles and started creeping up the windows. I kicked off my boots and started to wade in, started to try to reach the sinking cruiser and help whoever was trapped inside. But the water was cold, was shockingly cold, like ice water in the middle of February. And after maybe 3 steps, I felt something grab my ankle. Felt fingers wrap around my leg and pull me down toward the mud at the bottom. I jerked backward and pulled free, scrambled back to dry land, and watched as the cruiser finished sinking, watched it disappear beneath the black water without any bubbles or disturbance, just slipping under the surface like it had never existed. The water settled back to that perfect stillness, and in the silence I could hear that voice again, that woman's voice cutting through the static from my cruiser's radio. "You reached the end," she said. "Now you have to go back and try again. Try a different way. Try until you find the right path out." I walked back to my cruiser on shaking legs and got in, found the engine was still running despite the steam and the rough idle, found the gauges had settled back to normal readings. I put it in reverse and backed away from the water, backed away from that flooded section of highway where a cruiser had just sunk with a trooper still inside, and I turned around and started driving back the way I'd come. The road was normal again, was clean asphalt with clear markings, and the fog had thinned enough that I could see marker 37 approaching. I passed marker 37 and kept driving, kept waiting for the loop to reset and put me back at the beginning, but this time it didn't. This time I passed marker 36, marker 35, kept counting down until I reached marker 32 and saw the lights of Franklin in the distance, saw civilization and other vehicles, and proof that I'd escaped whatever trap had held me for hours. I checked my watch and found that only 40 minutes had passed since I'd started my shift, found that all those loops and all that driving had somehow compressed into less than an hour of real time. I drove straight to the station and filed a report that said I'd experienced equipment malfunctions and disorientation due to dense fog, requested the rest of the night off for health reasons, and went home to try to process what had happened. I couldn't tell anyone the truth. Couldn't explain that I'd been trapped in a time loop or spatial anomaly, or whatever it was without sounding insane, so I settled for the vague report and hoped that would be enough. But I can't stop thinking about that cruiser sinking into the black water. Can't stop thinking about the trooper sitting behind the wheel as it went under. Because the more I think about it, the more I remember details about what I saw, and the more those details suggest something I don't want to believe. The cruiser was an older model, was the type we used maybe 10 years ago, and the light bar configuration was the old style we'd phased out. And the trooper sitting in the driver's seat, the one I'd only seen as a silhouette through the fog and the water, had been wearing a uniform that looked exactly like mine. I did some research after that night, pulled old reports and incident logs from the parish records, and found a case from 12 years ago. Found a report about a state trooper who'd gone missing during a routine patrol on State Route 182 between Franklin and Morgan City. The trooper's name was Marcel Thibodeau, and he'd been working the overnight shift when he'd called in to dispatch reporting equipment malfunctions and disorientation, and that was the last anyone had heard from him. His cruiser was never found. His body was never recovered, and the case was eventually classified as a missing person with the assumption that he'd had an accident and ended up in one of the numerous waterways that bordered the highway. Marcel Thibodeau had been 29 years old, had been working for Louisiana State Police for 9 years, and had been assigned to patrol the exact same route I patrol now. The photograph in his personnel file showed a man who could have been my brother, showed someone with the same build and coloring, and I found myself staring at that photo wondering if I'd been seeing my own future when I watched that cruiser sink into the black water, wondering if I'd been looking at the end of my own story. I've driven State Route 182 hundreds of times since that night, have passed marker 37 countless times during my regular patrols, and I've never experienced the loop again. Have never found myself trapped in that repeating 18 minutes. But I'm careful now, am always aware of my position and my mile markers, am constantly checking to make sure I'm making progress and not circling back. And on foggy nights when visibility drops and the marsh presses in close on both sides of the road, I find myself listening for that woman's voice on the radio, listening for her warning about going the wrong way and needing to turn around. I don't know what I experienced that night, don't have an explanation that makes sense within the framework of normal reality. Was it a time loop, a spatial anomaly, some kind of trap set by the swamp itself to catch unwary travelers? Or was it a warning? A glimpse of what happened to Marcel Thibodeau 12 years ago? A message from the road, or from him, or from something else that wanted me to know what was waiting if I made the wrong choice? All I know for certain is that State Route 182 has more than just curves and straightaways between Franklin and Morgan City. Has places where the normal rules don't apply, and the road can trap you in patterns you can't escape. And I know that somewhere out there in the marsh, somewhere beneath black water that doesn't move, there's a cruiser with a trooper still sitting behind the wheel, still driving the same loop over and over, still trying to find the way out that I somehow found. I drive past marker 37 every shift, and every time I do, I think about those 18 minutes repeating forever. Think about how close I came to joining Marcel Thibodeau in whatever place he's trapped. And I'm grateful that I got out when I did. But I also wonder if I really got out, or if I just moved into a larger loop, a longer pattern that I haven't recognized yet. Because sometimes when I'm driving home after my shift ends, when I'm tired and not paying close attention, I'll pass a landmark that feels wrong, that feels like I saw it more recently than I should have, and I'll have to check my position to make sure I'm where I think I am. The swamp has a way of holding on to things, of keeping them close even when they think they've escaped, and I'm not sure I've escaped anything. I'm not sure any of us have. We're all just driving our routes and running our patrols and hoping that we don't end up like Marcel Thibodeau. Hoping that we don't take a wrong turn into a loop we can't escape. Hoping that when we reach the end of our shift, we actually get to go home instead of finding ourselves back at marker 37, starting the same 18 minutes over again. That's my story. That's what happened on State Route 182 on a foggy night in February. Make of it what you will, believe it or dismiss it. But if you ever find yourself driving that stretch of highway between Franklin and Morgan City and you pass the same mile marker twice, don't ignore it. Don't tell yourself you're just confused or disoriented. Turn around immediately. Get off that road by any means necessary, because if you wait too long, you'll end up like I almost did, trapped in a loop that only ends when you drive into black water and sink beneath the surface with no one to hear you calling for help. And if you see an old cruiser parked on the shoulder near marker 37, if you see a trooper standing there looking lost and confused, don't stop to help. Just keep driving. Keep your eyes forward, because that trooper has been there for 12 years and will be there for 12 more, and there's nothing you can do to help them except avoid becoming trapped there yourself. The loop is patient, is always waiting for the next driver who takes a wrong turn or ignores a warning. And once it has you, it doesn't let go until you've driven those same 18 minutes enough times that you forget there was ever anything else. I still patrol State Route 182, still pass marker 37 multiple times every shift. Still watch the fog roll in from the marsh and wonder if tonight will be the night it happens again. And I think about Marcel Thibodeau every single time. Think about a trooper who made one wrong turn and ended up driving the same stretch of road forever. And I hope that somehow, somewhere, he found the way out that I found. But I don't think he did. I think he's still there, still trapped in that loop, still sitting behind the wheel of his cruiser as it sinks into black water over and over for eternity. The road remembers. The swamp remembers. And somewhere between Franklin and Morgan City, between marker 37 and the end that isn't really the end, there's a place where time doesn't work right and space folds back on itself and troopers disappear into loops they can't escape. I found my way out once, but I don't know if I'll find it again if the road decides to trap me a second time. All I can do is stay alert, watch for the warning signs, and hope that when I reach the end of my route each night, I actually arrive somewhere different instead of finding myself back at the beginning. The loop is waiting. It's always waiting. And one night, when the fog is thick enough and I'm tired enough and I make just one small mistake, I'll find myself back at marker 37 with 18 minutes ahead of me and black water at the end. And I'll have to hope I'm lucky enough to escape a second time. But luck runs out eventually, and roads like State Route 182 have long memories and infinite patience. Drive carefully out there. Watch your mile markers. And if you ever find yourself passing the same landmark twice on a road you know, don't convince yourself it's just your imagination. Turn around and get out while you still can, because the loops are real, and they're hungry, and they're always looking for the next driver who won't be careful enough to notice until it's too late.